The first thing I noticed when I woke up was that I could not see my own feet. This was because my stomach was in the way. I sat up. The mattress underneath me wheezed. Spring coils dug into my back. The pillow smelled like an unwashed scalp and 3 days of cup noodles. I looked down at my body, which was, by any honest description, 120 kilograms of soft white flesh in a stained gray undershirt, and I knew, with a sinking feeling I would not be able to shake for a long time, exactly whose body I was in. I was Dae-shik, age 19, orphan, F-rank cultivator, Lackey of the future Black Serpent Society. Comic relief, Chapter 4 through Chapter 16 of the manhwa called the Iron Throne of Seoul. Dead in Chapter 17, crushed in the opening salvo of the gang war between the protagonist Lee Tae-hyun's White Tiger Brotherhood and my own boss Kim Hyun-woo's Black Serpent Society. The death was not even a scene. It was a single panel. A throwaway frame in which Dae-shik tried to run, slipped on his own blood, and got stomped by an unnamed enforcer. The author had given him no last words. I stared at the ceiling of the studio for a long moment. The ceiling had a water stain shaped vaguely like Australia. I said, out loud, in Dae-shik's wet whining voice, of course. Of course. Of course this was the body. Of course this was the chapter. Of course, of all the bodies in this enormous fictional soul that some Korean web novelist had spent 600 chapters building, I had landed in the one whose entire purpose in the narrative was to die badly to demonstrate that the gang war had started for real. I had read the manhwa. I had read all of it. I had read it on the toilet of a Mapo studio in my old life, on a cracked phone screen, between marketing reports for a company I had hated, and I remembered every chapter. I remembered the system of cultivation, the 8 stages from body tempering all the way up to the rumored heavenly realm. I remembered the noble houses, the Park family with their tiger lineage, the Kim family with their serpent lineage, the fallen Lee family of phoenix blood. I remembered the cafe scene from yesterday, in which Kim Hyun-woo had charmed Park Min-ji over iced Americano and Dae-shik had, in the background, leaned across to her best friend Choi Si-yeon and said something so embarrassing that the panel had to be drawn with a small sound effect of vomit in the corner of Soo-yeon's mouth. I remembered all of it. I remembered, in particular, the chapter index. Because everyone, when they read a manhwa, eventually scrolls to the end to check how many chapters there are. And I had done this with the Iron Throne of Seoul. I had scrolled. I had checked the table of contents. And I had read, with a kind of half attention, the list of chapter titles, because the author had been the sort of author who titled each chapter with a date and a faction name. Chapter 16, April 14th. Cafe. That was yesterday. Chapter 17, October 22nd. The Black Serpent loses its tail. That was 6 months from now. The fat lackey died in the first 3 pages of Chapter 17. The gang war started 2 pages later. The chapter ended with Lee Tae-hyun standing over the body, lighting a cigarette he did not smoke, saying the line that the fanbase had loved enough to print on t-shirts. I told you not to follow him. I sat on the wheezing mattress, in a studio that smelled like a public bathroom, in a body whose own thighs were touching at the knees, and I performed the only useful mental action available to me in that moment. I started to count. 6 months. 180 days, give or take. That was how much time I had, between the cafe scene of yesterday and the gang war that would, by the strict logic of the printed page, kill me on a sidewalk in Gangnam at approximately 1 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in October. 180 days. It was not nothing. It was not, however, very much. I lay back down on the mattress. I thought about a few things in the long minutes that followed. I thought about how, in the entire library of transmigration stories I had read on my cracked phone screen, the protagonist always woke up as a duke, or a crown prince, or at the very least a respected 4th son with a system in his head. I thought about how, in even the worst-case transmigration stories, the protagonist woke up as a villain, and even then, the villain at least had property, retainers, a noble title, a smug face that women on the street stopped to admire. I had woken up as none of these things. I had woken up as the villain's fat lackey, which is, in the hierarchy of transmigration outcomes, lower than being the villain. It is lower than being a side character. It is lower, in fact, than being the kind of nameless background extra who walks past the protagonist in panel 3 of Chapter 1 and never appears again, because the nameless background extra at least has the dignity of anonymity. I had a name. I had a body that was registered in the public records of the Republic of Korea. I had a face that had been drawn 140 times across 13 chapters, always with extra sweat. I had a verified phone number that the police could trace. I had, in other words, all of the visibility of an actual character and none of the privileges. I lay on the mattress and I thought, slowly and bitterly, everyone else gets transmigrated as the hero, or the villain, or, if they are extremely unlucky, as the third-ranked young master of a side family with a cultivation talent that is described as merely above average. Even the worst transmigrators in the entire genre of transmigrator stories get something. A face, a name with weight, a system in their head that whispers helpful menus, a cheat, a bloodline, an ancient master sealed in their dantian who will, eventually, agree to teach them. I got a body with 3 chins and a manhwa I had finished reading 2 months before I died. I had no system. I had checked. There was no blue text in my vision, no tutorial pop-up, no status window, no skill tree. The only thing in my vision was the water stain on the ceiling and the slow drift of a single dust mote across the morning light from a window I had not, in this body's 19 years of life, ever opened. I had no cheat. I had no bloodline. I had no master. I had no money. Go Dae-shik's bank account, which I could feel through the body's residual memory, had a balance of 87,001, which would buy approximately 3 meals if I was careful about it. I had no family. Go Dae-shik had been an orphan since age 8, raised by a state institution that had washed its hands of him at 14. Then I remembered the second-to-last chapter of the manhwa, chapter 590-something, the aftermath chapter where the author had, in a single rare moment of authorial generosity, gone back and tied up loose ends. The chapter had a list, in the margin of 1 page, of every character Lee Tae-hyun had personally killed over the course of his rise. The list was alphabetical. It included, in the G section, exactly 2 names. Gong Ji-suk, Go Dae-shik. It had not, when I read it on the toilet of the Mapo studio, struck me as significant. Lee Tae-hyun killed many people. The list was 3 pages long. It struck me now, because next to Go Dae-shik's name, the author had written a small parenthetical. The parenthetical said, tracked to Busan, for months after the war, in connection with knowledge of Kim Hyun-woo's old network. I closed my eyes. Plan A had been the plan of a man who had not finished reading. There was no Busan. There was no fish market. There was no quiet retirement. The protagonist of this story, the so-called hero Lee Tae-hyun, was the kind of man who finished his lists. Once Kim Hyun-woo died, Lee Tae-hyun would, with the slow patience of a man who did not like leaving threads loose, hunt down every former member of the Black Serpent Society and put a clean, efficient bullet in the back of each of their heads. The fat lackey was on the list. The fat lackey would die. The only question was whether the fat lackey would die in October on a Gangnam sidewalk or in February in a Busan alley. I opened my eyes. Plan A was dead, which left Plan B. Plan B was, become strong enough to refuse the entire arrangement. Strong enough to not die at the start of the gang war in October. Strong enough, eventually, to walk into Lee Tae-hyun's office and inform him that his alphabetical list had a mistake in it. Strong enough, perhaps, to deal with both of them. Plan B had one obvious problem. Plan B required me, Go Dae-shik, F-rank cultivator, 120-kilogram virgin orphan with no system and no master and no cheat code, to go from the bottom of the cultivation ladder to somewhere above 2 of the Manhwa's most overpowered named characters in less than 6 months. This was, by every metric the Manhwa had ever established for what cultivation required, impossible. Cultivation, in the modern world Dae-shik inhabited, was a multi-year discipline. Most awakened cultivators reached high body tempering by their early 20s after a decade of training. Foundation realm, the third stage, where a cultivator first sealed their chi into a stable core, was typically achieved in the late 20s or early 30s. The named characters of the Manhwa, Lee Tae-hyun and Kim Hyun-woo, were both, at this point in the story, mid-foundation realm, with hidden bloodline accelerants and personal training resources that ran into the billions of won per year. I had 87,000 won and a body that hurt when I sat up. I sat on the wheezing mattress and I thought about this for a long, hopeless moment. Then I remembered the second thing about this Manhwa. I remembered that Dae-shik had once, in a brief throwaway flashback in Chapter 11, been described by Kim Hyun-woo as having decent bass talent. The line had been delivered in a tone of mild contempt. Kim Hyun-woo had been telling another lackey that Dae-shik was, in principle, salvageable, a Stage 2 awakening, low chi awakening rating, a body that, if it had ever been trained, could have made early foundation by 25. The chapter had used the line to demonstrate Kim Hyun-woo's casual cruelty. He had said it to humiliate Dae-shik, to make him understand that he had wasted his potential, to make him sweat and grovel. It had not occurred to me, when I read it, that the line was also true. I lay back down on the mattress. I closed my eyes. I thought about the fat orphan whose body I now lived in. The orphan who had, at age 15, been awakened during a routine national screening, registered as Stage 2 with a low chi awakening rating, and then, because the orphan had no family and no money and no patron, been recruited as cannon fodder by the first noble house that had bothered to ask. The orphan who had, in the 4 years since, eaten his way to 120 kilograms not because he loved food, but because Kim Hyun-woo's table at the safe house always had food on it, and the food was free, and the orphan had spent his life eating only when food was free. I felt, lying there, an unexpected stab of sympathy for the kid whose body I had taken. He had not chosen this. He had not been written by the Manhwa's author with malice. He had been written with indifference. The author had needed a comic relief lackey. The author had given Dae-shik no inner life because the author had not needed Dae-shik to have one. The author had then killed him on a Wednesday in October because the author had needed a death scene. The kid had been alive for 19 years. He had been written as if he had been alive for none. I thought, with a kind of slow tightening in the body's chest. Okay, Dae-shik, wherever you went, I will use this. I will use this carefully. I will not waste what is left of you. I opened my eyes. I stood up. I walked, with the heavy gait of a body that had not walked far in 19 years, to the cracked mirror that hung over the studio's small sink. I looked at myself. I looked at the face that had appeared in 140 Manhwa panels with extra sweat, the wide cheeks, the small wet eyes, the thin oily hair, the chin that did not, particularly, exist. I said, to the face in the mirror, in the same wet whining voice that had said of course on the mattress. You had Stage 2 potential. You had a body that, if it had been trained, could have made foundation by 25. You had eyes that, behind all this, could have been the eyes of a hunter. You had a jaw that, under all this, has a real edge to it. You had a height, 6 feet, that nobody noticed because of everything else. You had everything you needed. You just didn't have anyone who believed you did. You have me now. I turned away from the mirror. I started to pack. Before I left the studio, I did one thing. I picked up the cracked phone on the bedside table, Dae-shik's phone, which contained, by the residual memory of the body, approximately 300 contacts of which 297 were Black Serpent associates. And I scrolled to Kim Hyun-woo's number, and I sent the message. The message said, "Boss, I'm sick. Stomach. I'm going to my hometown to recover. Be back in a few months. Sorry, I did not have a hometown. The author had given Dae-shik no hometown. But Kim Hyun-woo, I knew from the manhwa, did not check on his lackeys. He would receive the message. He would forget the message. In approximately 3 weeks, when Kim Hyun-woo eventually noticed that Dae-shik had not turned up to the weekly meeting at the noodle shop, he would shrug and assume the fat kid had finally gone home to drink himself to death, and he would never think about it again. The reply came back in 8 seconds. Kim Hyun-woo had written, "Get well, pig." That was the entire reply. I put the phone in my pocket. I left the studio. I walked to the nearest convenience store, bought 3 roll-on bags of compressed protein meals, 2 changes of cheap workout clothes, a pair of climbing shoes I had to size up twice to fit Dae-shik's swollen feet, a notebook, and a small fixed-blade knife the law allowed me to buy, because the law in this Korea recognized cultivation tools as a separate category. I spent 63,000 of the 87,000 won. I left 24,000 in the account for the trip back. Then I walked to the bus terminal. I bought a one-way ticket east, into the Taebaek Mountains, to a village called Wangalri whose name I had picked off a hiking blog because the blog had described it as the most remote settlement in Gangwon-do with a public bathhouse and a small Buddhist temple and otherwise no infrastructure of any kind. The bus took 6 hours. I got off at the last stop. I walked for another hour up a dirt road. I reached a clearing at the foot of a mountain whose name I did not know and did not need to know. I dropped the bag. I sat down on a flat stone. The sun was setting. I looked up at the mountain. The mountain was approximately 1,400 meters tall. The trail to the summit, the hiking blog had said, was a 3-hour walk for a normal hiker. I was not a normal hiker. I was 120 kilograms of unconditioned fat with feet that ached and lungs that whistled when I breathed. I thought, for 180 days, I am going to climb this mountain. Once a day, every day. From base to summit, summit to base. With the bag. With the knife. With one of the protein meals at the top and water from the streams on the way down. I am going to climb it on days when it rains, on days when it snows, on days when my legs do not want to move. I am going to climb it until the climb is easy, and then I am going to climb it harder. I am going to add weight to the bag. I am going to run sections. I am going to do the climb twice a day. 3 times. I am going to use the small dojo at the base of the mountain, the one the hiking blog mentioned, the one run by a retired wind blade lineage cultivator named Master Bakhyun, and I am going to pay him in labor for whatever scraps of training he is willing to give to a fat orphan who walks up his road. I am going to meditate every evening on this flat stone, and I am going to push my stage 2 awakening through to stage 3 on the strength of pure stubbornness, if nothing else. I do not have a system. I do not have a cheat. I do not have a master sealed in my dantian. I have 180 days, a mountain, and a body that the author of a manhwa decided was not worth writing. I am going to write it myself. I stood up. I shouldered the bag. I started to climb. The first month, I am not going to lie to you about, was the worst month of any life I had ever lived in either world. The first climb to the summit took me 11 hours. 11. By the time I reached the top, the sun had set and risen again, and I had crawled the last 200 meters on my hands and knees. My feet had blistered through the climbing shoes by hour 3. My calves had cramped by hour 5. By hour 7, I had thrown up the convenience store breakfast, and most of the water I had drunk to replace it. By hour 9, I was hallucinating mildly. I could see, in the corner of my vision, a small floating message that read no system available. Please train conventionally, which was either a real hallucination or a small piece of internal humor from the part of my brain that had read too many transmigration stories. I did not check which. I reached the summit at dawn. I ate a single protein meal. I lay on the flat rock at the top for 40 minutes. Then I stood up and walked down, because there was no plan in which lying on the summit qualified as training. The descent took 5 hours. By the time I reached the base, I was crying, openly, in the way a child cries who has been told they cannot stop yet. I crawled to the flat stone where I had begun. I sat. I meditated. I tried, for the first time in this body's 19 years of life, to circulate qi the way the cultivation manuals on the public internet described. I followed the basic body tempering circulation chart, the cheap one, the one the Manhwa had described as the entry-level method that every Stage 2 cultivator learned in the national screening centers. I sat for 2 hours. I felt almost nothing. A small flutter. A small warmth at the base of my spine. A small awareness that the qi inside my body had been, for 19 years, asleep, and that it was now stirring, slowly, like a dog being kicked awake. I went to sleep at midnight in a small tarp shelter I had set up next to the stone. I dreamed of nothing. I woke at 5 in the morning. I climbed the mountain again. The second climb took 10 hours. The third took 9. The fourth took 8. By the end of the first week, I could make the summit in 7 hours and the descent in 4, and I had thrown up only once that week. By the end of the second week, I had lost 6 kilograms. By the end of the third week, I had stopped throwing up entirely. My feet had calloused over, and Master Bakhyun of the small dojo at the base of the mountain, a wiry 60-year-old in faded gray robes who had watched me come down the trail each evening for 21 consecutive days, finally walked out to the flat stone, looked at me sitting in lotus posture trying to circulate qi, and said, "You're doing the chart wrong." I opened my eyes. I said, "I know, but it is the only chart I have." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Come to the dojo at 6 tomorrow morning. I will not teach you the wind blade form. I will not adopt you as a disciple, but I will fix your circulation chart, because watching you do it wrong every evening is keeping me awake, and I am too old to lose sleep over a fat boy with bleeding feet." I bowed. I said, "Thank you, Master." He said, "Do not call me Master. Call me Bakhyun. I will not have a fat lackey for a disciple, even an unofficial one." He turned and walked back to the dojo. The second month was the month I went from 120 kilograms to 106. It was the month Master Bakhyun, who was, despite his protests, by every functional measure my master, corrected my qi circulation, taught me the proper meridian routing, and pushed me, by the end of the month, into Stage 3. Body tempering low. The first true cultivator stage that mattered. The stage where the body began to refine its bone density, where the muscles began to repair faster than they tore, where the climb to the summit, which had taken 11 hours on day 1, now took 4. The third month, I learned to run. Not jog. Run. The mountain trail, full speed, with the bag, in the cold rain that came in off the East Sea in the spring. Bakhyun did not teach me the wind blade form, but he did teach me how to breathe while running, how to lock the diaphragm against the qi current, how to push the body's oxygen efficiency the way mid-tier cultivators did. By the end of the third month, I was making the summit in 2 hours flat and the descent in 50 minutes. I weighed 94 kilograms. My feet no longer blistered. My calluses had calluses. My core had begun to define itself under what had been, until 2 months prior, a soft white shelf of unused flesh. I pushed into Stage 3 high by the end of the third month, and I felt the first real edge of Stage 4, body tempering peak, at the base of my spine in the last week of it, like a small hard knot of qi that needed only a final concentrated effort to crack open. The fourth month, I did the climb 3 times a day. I do not know how to describe the fourth month in a way that does it justice. The fourth month was the month my body broke twice. Once when I tore the medial gastrocnemius in my left calf on the descent on day 86. Once when I cracked 2 ribs falling from a rock face on day 97. And Bakhyun set both injuries with a healing technique that was not, strictly, public knowledge, and I climbed through both. The fourth month was the month I went from 94 kilograms to 85. The month my face emerged out of the fat that had hidden it for 19 years. The month I caught my reflection in a mountain stream and did not, for the first second, recognize myself. The fourth month was the month I broke through to Stage 4, body tempering peak, and pushed, on the last day of the month, into Stage 5 low, qi awakening. The fifth stage in the Manhwa's cultivation system. The stage at which a cultivator's chi became externally usable, where techniques became possible, where, in the Manhwa's terms, you became a real player. The fifth month, I learned to fight. Bok Hyun, by the start of the fifth month, had stopped pretending I was not his disciple. He never used the word. But he stopped charging me for the dojo's bed in the back room he had let me use since the second month. He fed me at his own table. He taught me, slowly, the wind blade form, which was a foundation tier technique his family had developed 3 generations earlier and which he had not, in 20 years, taught to anyone because there had been no one worth teaching. The form was a long-range air-slicing technique that compressed chi into thin, invisible blades along the strike line of an open hand, and it was, by the standards of the Manhwa, a B-rank technique, strong, reliable, not flashy. I learned it in 24 days. Bok Hyun did not say I had learned it quickly. Bok Hyun did not say anything. He simply moved me, on day 125, to the next form, which was a sword technique he had developed himself in his 30s when the original Wind Blade School had not been ambitious enough for him. He gave me a wooden practice sword. He told me to come to the dojo every morning. He sparred with me, in the evenings, with the practice sword in his hand and the actual wind blade form on his open hand, and he beat me, the first 15 evenings, into the dojo floor so thoroughly that on 3 separate occasions I lost consciousness on impact. On the 16th evening, I drew blood from his cheek. He stopped. He touched the blood with one finger. He looked at the blood, and then he looked at me, and he said, "You have potential. I want you to know this." I said, "Thank you." He said, "You also have something else. Something I do not understand. You have clarity. You move like a person who knows what is coming next." I did not tell him I had read the book. I bowed. He bowed back. The 6th month was the month everything finally arrived. I broke through to stage 5 mid in the 2nd week of the 6th month, and to stage 5 high in the 4th week. I weighed 78 kilograms by the end of it. I was, by every honest measure, the most physically conditioned I had ever been in either of my 2 lives. I stood 6 feet exactly. My shoulders had widened with the muscle. My waist was narrow. My jaw, the jaw that the Manhwa author had drawn 140 times with extra sweat, had emerged, sharp and angular, from under the fat that had hidden it. My hair, which I had trimmed myself with the fixed blade knife at the side of a stream on day 112, had grown back darker, thicker. My eyes, the small wet pig eyes, had narrowed into the dry calculating eyes of a man who had spent 6 months looking up mountains and deciding to climb them. On the last evening of the 6th month, on the day before I planned to return to Seoul, I went to the small mountain stream where I had first not recognized myself, and I looked into the water again, and this time I looked for a long time. The face that looked back at me was the face of a man Dae-shik could have been if anyone, ever, had asked him to be. I thought, looking at the face, "You had so much in you, Dae-shik. You had a jaw. You had a height. You had a sharp pair of eyes nobody ever bothered to look at because they were looking at the fat. You had a stage 2 awakening that could have been a foundation cultivator by 25. You had everything you needed. You just had everyone who was supposed to help you decide, instead, that you were funny when you sweated. I am sorry, kid. I am sorry it took a stranger from another world to use what you had. I do not regret a minute of these 6 months. But I will, every day from now on, remember whose body this is." I stood up. I walked back to the dojo. Bok Hyun had cooked rice with mushrooms and small dried fish. We ate in silence. At the end of the meal, he looked at me across the low table and he said, "You are leaving tomorrow." I said, "Yes, master." He said, "Do not call me master." I said, "Bok Hyun." He said, "You are going back to fight someone." I said, "Yes." He said, "How many?" I said, "By the end of it, probably everyone." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "When it is over, if it goes well, come back. I have other forms. You have only seen 2. I said, "Yes, Bok Hyun." He said, "When it is over, If it goes badly, come back anyway. I am too old to find a new student. I bowed, deeply, the way I had not bowed to anyone, in either life, who had earned it. He waved me off. In the morning, before dawn, I shouldered the bag. The bag had a different set of contents now. The same fixed blade knife, plus a small wooden practice sword Bakhyun had given me as a parting gift, plus the wind blade form scroll he had finally written out for me in his own hand on the last night. I left the climbing shoes. They were finished anyway. I wore the second pair I had bought 6 months earlier, and they fit my feet exactly. I walked down the dirt road. I caught the first bus of the morning, west, back towards Seoul. The bus driver, when I boarded, did not recognize me. There was no reason he should have. I was a different man, but he had been the same driver who had brought me up 6 months earlier, and on the trip up he had given me a long, pitying look as I had wheezed my way to the back row. This morning he looked at me with the neutral indifference of a bus driver checking a ticket, and his eyes did the small flicker that bus drivers' eyes do when they notice that the passenger is a cultivator they do not want to provoke. He did not say good morning. I did not say good morning. I sat at the back. I watched the mountains roll past in the dark. I thought, very quietly, about the chapter of the Manhwa I was about to walk into. The bus came down out of the Taebaek range at noon. The skyline of Seoul came up on the horizon at 3. I changed buses at the eastern terminal at 4. I rode the metro from there to Gangnam, which was, by the residual memory of Dae-shik's body, where Kim Hyun-woo took his afternoon coffee on Wednesdays at the Black Serpent's preferred Italian place on the 3rd floor of a glass building on Tehran Aro. It was a Wednesday. I had not, when I left the village in the morning, planned to walk directly into the lion's mouth on my first day back. I had decided, somewhere on the second bus, that this was, on balance, the most efficient way to begin. I came up the escalator at the Gangnam station at 4:45. I walked north on Tehran Aro. I was wearing a plain black coat I had bought from a roadside vendor at the bus terminal, over the same dark pants and white shirt I had worn for the second half of the bus ride. My hair was tied back loosely. My shoulders, under the coat, registered to passers-by as the shoulders of someone they did not want to bump into. A woman in a business suit walked past me, took 2 steps, and turned around to look at me again. I did not return the look. I stopped at the front door of the glass building. I looked up at the 3rd floor. In my chest, the chi I had spent 6 months awakening pulsed once, very calmly, very evenly, in the rhythm Bakhyun had taught me. The wooden practice sword was inside my coat against the small of my back. The wind blade scroll was rolled tight in an inside pocket against my heart. I thought, very quietly, "Hello, Hyunwoo." I walked in. The Italian restaurant on the 3rd floor was the kind of restaurant that announced itself to the city by the marble floor of its lobby and the brass railing on its staircase and the maitre d's pin, which was a small enameled badge in the shape of a serpent eating its own tail. The serpent badge meant the restaurant was a Black Serpent Society affiliate. The society took 10% of the gross, and the restaurant, in return, was permitted to operate in this part of Gangnam without trouble. This was the kind of arrangement that did not appear in the manhwa, because the manhwa had been written by an author who was not interested in the small infrastructure of how organized cultivation gangs actually paid their rent, but it was the kind of arrangement that the residual memory of Dae-shik's body knew, the way a body knows the layout of a parent's apartment. I walked up to the maitre d'. The maitre d' was a tall, thin man in a dark green vest who had, by my count, been the maitre d' of this restaurant for the 11 months of Dae-shik's tenure on Hyunwoo's Wednesday rounds. He had, in the original timeline, watched Dae-shik trip over the welcome mat in Chapter 8. He had laughed about it later to a waitress. He looked at me now with the alert, flat expression of a man calculating whether the stranger at his podium was a cultivator he should be polite to. He said, "Good afternoon, sir. Do you have a reservation?" I said, "I'm with the Hyunwoo table." His face did the small, involuntary tightening that the faces of organized affiliate restaurant staff do when they have been told to expect particular guests, and the particular guest at the podium is not on the list. He glanced down at the reservation book. He glanced back up. He did the second small tightening of a man who has just realized the stranger at his podium has the chief signature of at least a stage 5 cultivator, which was above his own pay grade. He said, "I see. Please follow me, sir." He turned and walked toward the back of the restaurant. I followed. We passed the open dining floor, perhaps 30 tables, 3/4 full, mostly business people and the occasional cultivator couple from one of the smaller houses. Heads turned as I walked past. Not many, just enough. A woman in a navy dress stopped mid-sentence to follow me with her eyes. A man at the bar made the small, involuntary chi gesture of registering another cultivator's signature and registered too high, and looked down at his glass. The private dining room at the back had a glass wall facing the city and a door of dark wood with a brass handle in the shape of a serpent's head. The maitre d' opened the door. He bowed by exactly the angle his training required. He did not announce me, because he did not know what to announce. I stepped through. There were 4 people in the room. Kim Hyun-woo was at the head of the long, oval table, in the chair facing the door, in a charcoal suit the cut of which the Manhwa's author had described, in a panel I now remembered with painful precision, as the kind of suit that costs 8 months of an ordinary man's salary. He was 25 years old. He was, by the standards of any modern Korean media outlet, devastatingly attractive, tall, sharp-jawed, with the kind of black eyes that lit up cameras and the kind of slow smile that, in the Manhwa, had made 3 named women fall in love with him over the course of the first arc. He was, by his chi signature, mid-foundation realm. He was, in this room, the most powerful cultivator by a comfortable margin, and his shoulders were set in the easy slouch of a man who had not, in years, been required to consider this. To his left sat Park Min-ji. Min-ji was the heroine. She was 23. She wore a white dress with a thin black belt, and her hair was loose over one shoulder. She was, by the Manhwa's Chapter 5 line, the second most beautiful woman in the registered noble houses of Seoul, and her chi signature was high foundation. Already, at 23, ahead of where most cultivators of her age were, because she had been born with the Park family's tiger lineage and trained from age 4. Her father, Lord Park, owned the 3rd largest cultivation school in Korea. She was the heroine of the Manhwa not because she had been chosen by either Hyun-woo or Tae-hyun, but because she was, in her own right, the kind of person around whom plots organized themselves. To her left sat Choi Soo-yeon. Soo-yeon was 23 also. Her family ran the Windblade lineage that Bak-hyun's Mountain Dojo had been a small, unofficial offshoot of, which I had only realized in the 3rd month and which Bak-hyun had never mentioned. She was the 2nd strongest cultivator of her generation in the Choi house. She wore a black blouse and a dark gray skirt and a small silver pin at her collar in the shape of a folded fan. She was, by the Manhwa's standards, beautiful in a different register than Min-ji. Sharper, drier, with the kind of mouth that did not, in any chapter, smile at anything the author wrote. She was also, by the residual memory of Dae-shik's body, the woman the original fat Lackey had flirted with at the cafe in Chapter 16. The 4th person was a man I did not, at first, recognize. He was in his early 30s, with the long, thin face of a serious cultivator and a black leather notebook open in front of him. He was Hyun-woo's lieutenant. The notebook contained the Wednesday agenda. I would learn his name later. His name does not, at this point in the story, matter. The 4 of them looked up as I entered. Hyun-woo's eyes did the small registration. He registered that the person who had entered his private dining room was not on his guest list. He registered that the chi signature of the person was at stage 5 high, which was, in his casual mental hierarchy, beneath him but not contemptibly so. He registered that the person was tall, lean, and unfamiliar. He did not, in the first 2 seconds, recognize me. This was the part of the scene that the Manhwa author had never, in 600 chapters, written. The author had never written the moment in which Kim Hyun-woo, at the head of a private dining table, did not recognize a person who walked into his Wednesday meeting. The author had not needed to write it. In the original timeline, no such moment had occurred. In the original timeline, Wednesday's meeting had gone exactly as planned. The fat lackey had not been present because he was nursing a cold in his studio, and the 4 people in this room had drunk their coffee, gone over the week's logistics, and parted at 5:30. This Wednesday was not going to go that way. I walked up to the table. I pulled out the empty chair to Hyun-woo's right, the chair the original fat lackey would have sat in if the fat lackey had been at this Wednesday's meeting, and I sat down. Minji's eyes flicked, very briefly, to my face, and then to my shoulders, and then back to my face. Soo-yeon's mouth, which had been about to say something to Minji, did not finish saying it. Hyun-woo studied me for another 3 seconds. Then he said, in a flat voice that did not yet carry the affection he reserved for guests, "I'm sorry." "Who are you?" I said, "Boss. I'm back." He went still. He looked at me, really looked at me, with the focused attention of a Foundation Realm cultivator examining another cultivator's signature and frame at the same time, and the recognition arrived in him at the speed of a slap. He said, in a voice that was not flat at all anymore, "Dae-shik." I said, "Yes." He said, "Pig." I said, "That one I'd ask you to drop, boss." The silence in the room was the silence of a private dining room that had been set up for a relaxed Wednesday meeting and had suddenly become a stage on which a thing was happening that no one in the room could yet name. Minji's hand had stopped halfway to her water glass. Soo-yeon was staring at me with the expression of a woman who had spent her life being correct about people and who was, for the first time in her life, recalibrating. Hyun-woo's eyes did the small thing they did in the manhwa when his calculations were not adding up. The small narrowing. The small adjustment. He said, "How?" I said, "I went to my hometown. I climbed a mountain. 6 months. I am back." He said, "That is impossible." I said, "It is unusual." He said, "Stage 5 high in 6 months from stage 2 low without a master, without a sect, without a system. That is not unusual. That is impossible." I said, "I had a teacher." He said, "Who?" I said, "I would prefer not to involve him." Hyun-woo was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was a real laugh. It was a delighted laugh. It was the laugh of Kim Hyun-woo, the villain of the manhwa, the slow-smiling, charming man who had risen through the cultivation underworld of Seoul on a combination of personal lethality and the ability to be amused by the world, doing the thing the manhwa had described him doing in Chapter 3 when he had first seen Park Min-ji across a hotel lobby and decided he was going to make her his. He laughed, and then he leaned back in his chair, and he said, "Dae-shik, my pig, my disappointment. My, what did you say? My stage 5 high?" He said, "Do you know what this means?" I said, "Probably." He said, "I have an opening on the executive floor. Lieutenant grade. The previous lieutenant retired last month for medical reasons. Did you know about the opening?" I said, "I knew." He said, "Are you taking it?" I said, "No." The laugh died. It died slowly. It did not vanish from his face. It receded, the way the tide receded, into the small, fixed smile of a man who had just been refused by a person he had not been aware was capable of refusal. He said, "No." I said, "No, boss. I came back to tell you I'm out. I'm not Black Serpent anymore. I'm not anyone's lackey. I am myself." I said, "I came in person because it was the polite thing to do. I owed you that much. For years of meals at your safe house. I have not forgotten." I said, "I am also asking you to leave me alone. I am not in your way. I will not be in your way. The gang war that is coming, and I think you know it is coming, does not need to involve me. The White Tigers do not need to involve me. I will operate in the parts of the city the two of you do not want." I said, "This is my one and only request. Take it." The silence at the table was the silence of a Wednesday afternoon meeting that had become, in the space of 30 seconds, an event none of the parties present would forget for the rest of their lives. Hyun-woo studied me. Then he said, very softly, "Pig, are you giving me a request?" I said, "I am giving you an offer. I am not, anymore, in a position to make a request. I am not, anymore, the kind of person who makes requests of you." His eyes narrowed. His chi rose. It rose the way the chi of mid-foundation cultivators rises, slowly, calmly, like a pot brought to boil. The dining room's air, which had been the air of a comfortable restaurant, became the air of a room that contained a serpent and a man who had walked in carrying nothing visible. Minji set her water glass down. Soo-yeon's hand had moved, very slightly, toward the silver fan pin at her collar. The lieutenant on Hyun-woo's left did the small motion of a man preparing to reach for the gun under the table. I did not move. I did not, in fact, change anything about the way I was sitting. I let my own chi, the chi I had spent 6 months awakening, the chi that was, by the standards of the stage 5 high register, 2 whole stages below Hyun-woo's, rise to meet his at the threshold of the dining room's air, and I let him feel it. I let him feel that the chi of a stage 5 high cultivator who had spent 6 months climbing a mountain twice a day with a wooden sword on his back was not the same chi as the chi of a stage 5 high cultivator who had been promoted through a corporate examination at 22 and never been physically tested. I let him feel the density of it, the compression, the way the chi had been pressed down into the bone, the way a master compresses fish stock into a small, fierce reduction. He felt it. His own chi held, but it did not push. He looked at me for one long moment. Then he said, in the slow voice of a man who had just decided that the most interesting thing he could do in this Wednesday was not the thing he had walked into the room planning to do. "Pig, sit. Drink coffee with us. I will think about your request." I said, "No, boss." I stood up. I said, "I have other appointments. Think about it. Tell my old phone if you decide." I will not, however, be answering the phone. I bowed by exactly the angle the manhwa's author had drawn Dae-shik bowing in Chapter 4, the slavish overdone bow of a sycophant, but I bowed it now, as a different man, in a way that made it not a bow of submission but a bow of departure. The kind of bow a man gives to an old room he is leaving and does not intend to return to. I walked out of the dining room. The maitre d', in the corridor, opened the door for me. I went down the stairs. I went out the front door of the building. I walked west on Tehran Aro for 2 blocks. I stopped at a small cafe with a single empty outdoor table, and I sat down, and I ordered a coffee, because, after 6 months of mountain stream water, I had decided that the first cup of black coffee in Seoul was something I was owed. The coffee arrived in 3 minutes. In the 8th minute, Soo-yeon sat down across from me. She had followed me out of the building. She did not, at first, say anything. She set her small handbag on the empty chair beside her. She looked at me across the table with the same recalibrating expression she had worn in the private dining room. Her eyes were a flat, dark brown, with a focus to them that I had read described in the Manhwa as the focus of a woman who had spent her life being the most observant person at every party she had attended. She said, eventually, "You are Dae-shik." I said yes. She said, "At the cafe yesterday, you said to me, quote, 'Soo-yeon, you should sit on my lap. I have been told it is a comfortable place to land.'" I said, "I am very sorry. I had different vocabulary then." She said, "You have different vocabulary now." I said yes. She studied me for another long moment. She said, "My family has a wind blade lineage. My uncle, who is the head of the school, he had, a younger brother, Bak-hyun, who was disowned 31 years ago for refusing the family's leadership. The disowning was acrimonious. No one in our family has spoken his name in 19 years. He retired to a mountain in Gangwon, and we have, by mutual agreement, not contacted him." I said, "I know." She said, "You trained with him." I said, "I did." She said, "That is extraordinarily fortunate." I said, "I climbed his mountain 21 days before he came down to fix my circulation. He did not come for me. He came for himself. He was tired of watching me do the chart wrong. She was quiet. She said, "You have learned the wind blade form." I said, "I have." He gave me the scroll. Her hand, on the table, tightened, very slightly, on the rim of her saucer. She said, "That scroll has not been outside my family in 3 generations." I said, "He gave it to me. He said the school did not deserve to keep it, and I would use it better. I would prefer this not become a house matter." She said, "It is already a house matter. You wearing it on your person makes it one. But, for the moment, I will not raise it with my uncle. I will wait." She paused. She said, "Why?" I said, "Why are you waiting?" She said, "Yes." I said, after a moment, "Because the Manhwa says you are good. Because the chapters describe you as a woman who pays close attention before she decides. Because the author who drew the panel in which you looked at the fat lackey with disgust also drew, on the very next page, you looking at the fat lackey with, for one frame, pity." I noticed the pity. The author did not mean for me to notice the pity. But I did. I do not, anymore, expect the pity. But I expect that you will, for now, watch instead of acting. She did not move. Her eyes did, very slightly, the smallest possible reaction. She said, "I do not know what Manhwa is." I said, "It does not matter. You will, in time, choose to watch. That is all I am asking." I drank my coffee. She watched me drink it. Then she said, very softly, "Who are you?" I said, "I am Dae-shik. I have just been, until recently, not anyone in particular. I will soon be more." She stood up. She picked up her handbag. She bowed, slightly, with the same dry mouth she always wore, and she said, "I will watch." She walked back toward the glass building. I sat at the cafe for another 20 minutes, drinking the coffee, watching the street. Minji did not come. That was, I decided, fine. Minji, in the Manhwa, was a woman who took longer to make decisions than Soo-yeon. Minji would arrive in her own time. I paid for the coffee. I stood up. I walked east, away from the glass building, into the deeper grid of Gangnam, with my hands in my coat pockets and the wooden sword at my back and the wind blade scroll over my heart. I had, by my own quiet count, 2 of the Manhwa's named characters now aware of me. 1 villain, 1 witness. The villain would, in the next 48 hours, decide something. The witness would, in the next 48 hours, watch. I had work to do in those 48 hours. The work did not involve either of them. The work involved a small, scrappy, second-tier gang on the eastern edge of Gangnam called the Iron Ribbon Brotherhood. The Iron Ribbon was a 6-man crew with a single Stage 5 low leader and 5 Stage 4 soldiers. They ran protection on a 4-block stretch of restaurants and convenience stores and made approximately 30 million won a month. The Manhwa had mentioned them once, in Chapter 22, as a footnote. The footnote had read, "Absorbed by the White Tiger Brotherhood during the post-war consolidation." The footnote had not described the absorption because it had not been important. It was about to become important. Because the Iron Ribbon was not, by the standards of any organized cultivation gang in Seoul, large. But the Iron Ribbon controlled 4 blocks. The 4 blocks contained 12 restaurants, 8 convenience stores, 3 karaoke parlors, a noodle shop run by an old woman who had been baking the same red bean buns for 40 years, and a small dojo for after-school cultivation lessons for the children of the area. I did not intend to absorb the Iron Ribbon. I intended to replace it. The plan was simple. I had walked it through on the bus down from the mountain. I had refined it during the long 6 hours of the second bus. The plan was, tonight, after sundown, I would walk into the Iron Ribbon's main bar, the small basement place on the east edge of the 4 blocks where the leader, a man named Yang Ki-hwan, drank 3 beers a night with his lieutenants. And I would, in the small focused way I had been practicing for 6 months, beat the entire Iron Ribbon Brotherhood into the floor of the bar in less than 4 minutes. I would not kill any of them. Killing them at this stage would attract the wrong attention. I would beat them, individually and collectively, into the kind of injury that took 3 months to recover from. I would, while they were on the floor, explain to Yang Ki-hwan that I was taking over his 4 blocks effective immediately, that he and his crew were free to leave the city or stay as private citizens, and that if any of them ever again collected a single one of protection money from the residents of the 4 blocks, I would, personally, find them and break parts of them that did not heal. Then I would, in the morning, walk to each of the 12 restaurants and the 8 convenience stores and the 3 karaoke parlors and the noodle shop with the red bean buns, and I would tell the owners that the iron ribbon was gone, that their protection payments were suspended for the next 6 months while I established my own operation, and that, when payments resumed, the new rate would be half of what they had been paying the iron ribbon, and that the new operation would not, as the iron ribbon had, sell the daughters of the area to overseas cultivation auctions as a side business. The new operation would have one rule. The rule was, the 4 blocks were under my protection, and if anyone, including the White Tiger Brotherhood or the Black Serpent Society, interfered with the residents of the 4 blocks, the operations representative would come, personally, and have words with them. The new operation needed a name. I had, somewhere between Bus 1 and Bus 2, settled on the name. The name was Bak Hyun's name for the form he had developed in his 30s when the original Wind Blade School had not been ambitious enough for him. The name was the Cutting Wind. The Iron Ribbons bar was a basement off an alley behind a hagwon. The hagwon advertised cultivation tutoring for university entrance exams. The bar advertised nothing. The Iron Ribbons' 6 members drank there on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 9 to midnight, behind a steel door that opened only when the bouncer on the inside recognized the code knock. The code knock, by Dae-shik's residual memory, was 3 quick and 2 slow. Dae-shik had been to this bar once in his life, on an errand to deliver a small package from Hyunwoo to Yang Ki-hwan in Chapter 9. I walked into the alley at 10:15 on Wednesday night. I knocked. The bouncer opened the slot. He was a stage 4 cultivator in his early 30s, with a shaved head and a tattoo of a small ribbon on his neck. He looked through the slot at me. He did not recognize me. He said, "Who?" I said, "Go Dae-shik. Black Serpent. Boss Yang knows me." He said, "Wait." The slot closed. I heard him on the inside, talking to someone. After a moment, the slot opened again. He said, "Come in." The door opened. I went in. The bar was small. 8 tables. A low ceiling. A long mirror behind the bar that had been cracked in the corner. Yang Ki-hwan sat at the back booth with 3 of his lieutenants. The bouncer was the 4th. The 5th lieutenant, Yang Ki-hwan, ran a 6-man operation including himself, was, I noted by the empty stool at the bar in the bathroom. 5 iron ribbon cultivators visible. 1 in the bathroom. The bar had no other customers. Yang Ki-hwan looked up. He frowned. He said, in the slightly drunk voice of his 3rd beer, "Dae-shik, you've lost weight." I said, "Yes, Boss Yang." He said, "A lot of weight. What did you do, get cancer?" I said, "Training." He laughed. He said, "Training. You're training. That's good. Sit down. Have a drink. What did Hyunwoo send you here for?" "We are on schedule for the month, tell him." I said, "Hyunwoo did not send me." He paused. He said, "Who sent you?" I said, "I came myself." He was quiet for a second. He said, "For what?" I said, "I am taking your blocks. Tonight. I will not kill you. I will hurt you. The hurt will take 3 months to heal. After that you are free to leave the city, or to stay as a private citizen and find honest work. You will not, after tonight, collect protection from anyone in the 4 blocks. If you try, I will find you, and I will break things that do not heal." I said, "You have 1 chance to walk out of this room. You may take it now." I waited. The bar was silent for 2 heartbeats. Then Yang Ki-hwan started to laugh. His 3 lieutenants started to laugh. The bouncer at the door, behind me, started to laugh. The 5th lieutenant came out of the bathroom and saw everyone laughing and started to laugh without knowing why. I waited for them to finish. Yang Ki-hwan, still laughing, picked up the beer bottle on the table in front of him. He threw it at my face. I caught the bottle 2 inches from my nose. I did not catch it with my hand. I caught it with a thin compressed plate of chi I had pulled out of the air using the wind blade form's defensive variation, which Baekhyun had taught me in month 4. The bottle stopped. The bottle did not break. It hung in the air at eye level. It rotated, slowly, in place, while the chi plate held it. The laughter at the table died. The 5 Iron Ribbon members were, by their chi signatures, an average of stage 4 mid-Yang Ki-hwan. The strongest was stage 5 low. I was stage 5 high. The math, by the simple linear arithmetic of cultivation grades, was that I outranked Yang Ki-hwan by 1 full stage and his lieutenants by 1.5. The math, by the practical arithmetic of who had trained their chi how, was that I outranked Yang Ki-hwan by approximately 3 full stages. I gestured. The bottle came forward, slowly, through the air, and settled gently on the booth's table in front of Yang Ki-hwan, upright, in exactly the position he had picked it up from. I said, "You have 1 chance to walk out of this room. You may take it now, or you may take it in 3 months when you can walk again. I am offering the easy version. The easy version is now." Yang Ki-hwan stared at the bottle for a long moment. Then he made the small motion of a man committing to the worst option. The bouncer at the door behind me lunged first. He was the closest. He was stage 4 mid. He came in low, with a knife in his hand, a short cultivation blade with a chi-conducting edge, aimed for my kidney. He had, by every visible signal of his form, been trained well by Iron Ribbon's standard syllabus. I stepped back into him. I did not turn. I stepped back, with my heel coming down on his instep at the exact moment his weight shifted forward for the knife strike. His foot folded. He went down. His knife went past me, into the empty air where my kidney would have been if I had not stepped. I caught his wrist as he fell, twisted it 90 degrees against the joint, and the radius bone in his forearm snapped with a small wet pop that was, by my count, the loudest sound in the bar for the next second. I let him fall. He lay on the floor of the bar, making a small whimpering sound that did not yet quite know it was supposed to be a scream. The 4 lieutenants at the booth came up out of their seats at the same time. The first one, stage 4 mid, holding a folding tactical baton he had pulled from inside his jacket, was the fastest. He came at me with the baton in a long horizontal sweep aimed at the side of my head. I ducked under the sweep. As the baton passed over me, I straightened, with my elbow coming up in a short upward strike that caught him under the chin and lifted him approximately 10 centimeters off the ground. His head hit the booth's overhead light fixture. The light fixture cracked. He came down on the booth's table. The table cracked. He did not get up. The second lieutenant, stage 4 high, the strongest of the 4 after Yang Ki-hwan, was smarter. He had not come in immediately. He had stepped back, drawn a stage 4 cultivation pistol from his belt, and was now leveling it at my chest. The pistol was a converted Heckler & Koch P30, modified by a private cultivation armorer to channel chi-augmented rounds. The rounds had, the Manhwa had informed me, an effective lethality against unaugmented body up through high stage 4. I was high stage 5. He fired. I tilted my head approximately 7 centimeters to the left. The round passed my ear with a high thin whine. The window behind me, which had been a small reinforced window with a heavy iron grill, took the round, and the entire grill rattled. I crossed the 4 meters between us in approximately a quarter of a second using the wind blade form's movement variation, which Baekhyun had refined into a thing that was not, strictly, teleportation but was, by appearance, indistinguishable from it at short ranges. I closed on the second lieutenant. I caught his pistol wrist. I twisted. The pistol came free. I put my palm flat against his sternum and released the wind blade form's basic palm strike, a compressed disc of chi the diameter of a saucer, directly into his ribcage. The disc passed through the front of his ribcage and stopped exactly at the back wall of it, which was the calibration Baekhyun had drilled into me for non-lethal strikes. The lieutenant's eyes went very wide. He folded backward into the booth, with 3 of his ribs visibly broken under his shirt and his lungs intact. He would, by every standard medical assessment of cultivation strikes, recover in 14 weeks. The 3rd and 4th lieutenants, both stage 4 mid, came at me from opposite sides, in the kind of coordinated double attack that Iron Ribbon trained for. They were, by their movements, the closest pair of brothers in the gang, and they had drilled this exact attack for years. I let them close. I dropped to one knee at the moment of their convergence, with both my arms going up and out in the wind blade form's defensive cross. 2 compressed chi blades sliced upward from my open palms at exactly opposite angles, each one passing through the inside of one brother's thigh, through the femoral muscle, missing the femoral artery by the half-centimeter margin Bakhyun had drilled into me, and out the other side. Both brothers went down. They went down without screaming, because the chi blades cauterized as they cut. They would not bleed out. They would not, however, walk again for at least 4 months. I stood up. I turned to Yang Ki-hwan. Yang Ki-hwan was the last one in the bar still on his feet, and he was no longer laughing. The fight, from the moment the bouncer had lunged, had taken approximately 11 seconds. Yang Ki-hwan looked at the 4 down lieutenants. He looked at the bouncer. He looked at me. He said, in the voice of a man who had finally understood the math, "I'll walk out." I said, "Take your wallet. Leave your gun. Leave the 4 blocks tonight." He nodded. He walked, with the small, careful steps of a man trying not to provoke the predator at the other end of the room, past me, to the door. He opened the door. He went out. I heard his footsteps go up the alley. I did not hear them stop until they reached the street. I turned back to the 4 men on the floor, the bouncer with the broken arm, the lieutenant with the cracked light fixture and the cracked table, the lieutenant with the 3 broken ribs, the 2 brothers with the cauterized thigh wounds. I said, to the room, "I am, as of tonight, the cutting wind. The 4 blocks above this basement are mine. You will not interfere. You will, if you wish, find new employment. There is a noodle shop on the east end of the 3rd block run by an old woman who needs an extra pair of hands. She pays in noodles and small money. She does not, as your former boss did, sell daughters. I recommend the noodle shop." I walked to the door. At the door I paused, and I said over my shoulder, "If any of you, in 3 months when you have healed, come back to the 4 blocks with a weapon, I will know, and I will not be polite the second time." I left. I walked up the alley. I came out on the street. I walked 4 blocks west, to a small 24-hour cafe that the Manhwa had once described as the kind of cafe that the small cultivators of Gangnam used as a neutral meeting ground. I ordered a coffee. I sat in the back booth. I took out my phone and I checked the time. It was 11:15 on Wednesday night. I had, in the past 7 hours, refused Kim Hyun-woo's lieutenant offer in front of 3 witnesses, established the first watcher in the form of Choi Soo-yeon, and taken over the first 4 blocks of my new operation. I had, by the count of the Manhwa's chapters, 8 days until the moment Hyun-woo would, in the original timeline, have made his first move on Park Min-ji's family. I had 31 days until the moment Lee Tae-hyun would have made his countermove. I had 180 days until the gang war I no longer intended to die in. In 8 days, I needed to have established the cutting wind across at least a dozen more blocks. I needed a lieutenant. I had one in mind. In the morning, I made the rounds of the 4 blocks. The owners reacted the way the owners of small businesses always react to a change of operator, with the muted, careful politeness of people who have been afraid for a long time and are not yet sure whether the new operator will give them a different thing to be afraid of. I introduced myself by name. Go Dae-shik. The cutting wind. The terms were the terms I had decided on the night before. Payments suspended for 6 months. Half rate thereafter. No daughters. Anyone interferes, call this number. I wrote out a number on the back of receipts and napkins, the new number of a new phone I had bought that morning. I was at the noodle shop by 10. The owner of the noodle shop, Halmoni Kong, the Manhwa had called her, In a single panel in Chapter 42, when Lee Tae-hyun had stopped in to eat, was 83 years old, for feet 11, with hands that the Manhwa had described as the hands of a sculptor. She was making red bean buns when I came in. The smell, when the door opened, was the smell of a building that had had red bean buns in it for 40 years. She looked up at me from her workboard. She said, "You are the new boy?" I said, "Yes, Halmoni." She said, "You are taller than the last one. You are also nicer." I said, "I am hoping to be." She said, "I will give you a bun. Sit down." She brought me a bun and a small bowl of tea. I sat at the front table. I ate the bun. The bun was the best red bean bun I had ever eaten. I told her so. She did not, externally, react, but her shoulders did a small thing that suggested it had been a long time since anyone had told her so out loud. I said, "Halmoni, I have a question." She said, "Ask." I said, "There is a young man who lives in this neighborhood. His name is Bae Tae-ho. He is 24. He was, 2 years ago, a promising stage for cultivator on track for a place in the Park family's outer guard. He failed the entrance examination because his parents could not afford the 3rd round of cultivation pills required. He has, since then, worked as a delivery boy for the Iron Ribbon at night and as a janitor at a hagwon during the day. Do you know him?" She said, "He eats noodles here every Tuesday and Thursday. He pays me even though I told him not to." I said, "Where does he live?" She told me. I said, "Thank you, Halmoni." She said, "You are taking him with you." I said, "I am offering him a job." She said, "He is a good boy. Do not waste him." I said, "I do not intend to." I bowed. I left. I walked to the address she had given me. Bae Tae-ho lived in a Gashawon room on the 2nd floor of a building 3 blocks east, in the kind of room that was the size of 2 single beds laid end to end. He was, when I knocked, eating instant ramen on the floor of his room in his work clothes. He was a tall, thin young man with a long jaw and a body that, even underfed, carried the dense, compressed cultivation of a stage for cultivator who had been training without proper food or rest for 2 years. He looked up at the door. I said, "My name is Dae-shik. I run the Cutting Wind. I am offering you a job. The job is lieutenant grade. Full medical. Pills included. Cultivation training under me personally. The work involves protecting the 4 blocks above the Iron Ribbon's old bar, plus whatever blocks we add. The pay is 6 million won a month, plus a 5% share of operations." He stared at me. He said, "You are Dae-shik." I said, "Yes." He said, "The fat one." I said, "I have, in the past 6 months, recalibrated." He said, "I have heard, this morning, that someone took the Iron Ribbon out last night." I said, "That was me." He was quiet. He said, "How many?" I said, 6. Yang Ki-hwan left. The other 5 are in the hospital. He said, "Alone." I said, "Alone." He said, "In how long?" I said, 11 seconds. He set down his ramen. He said, "When do I start?" I said, "Now?" He said, "Yes, boss." He stood up. He picked up the small bag at the foot of his bed that he had, by the look of it, kept packed for some time, the way a young man keeps a bag packed when he is waiting for a different life. He followed me out of the Gashawon. He was my first lieutenant. He was, over the next 4 weeks, joined by 7 more. I will spare you the full account of the 4 weeks. The 4 weeks were, in their detail, a procession of similar evenings, me, alone or with Tae-ho, walking into the small bars of 2nd-tier and 3rd-tier gangs across Gangnam and the southern districts, refusing to be intimidated, fighting only when necessary, leaving the gang's leadership with cracked ribs and the gang's membership with the choice of joining the Cutting Wind or finding honest work. Most chose the Cutting Wind. A few did not. None, by the end of the 4 weeks, came back. By the end of the 4 weeks, the Cutting Wind had 19 blocks. It had 2.5 million won a day in revenue. It had 8 lieutenants, 40 soldiers, and a small office building in the eastern edge of Gangnam that I had purchased outright with the operating cash flow. I had, in those 4 weeks, broken approximately 42 cultivator bones, killed exactly 0 people, and acquired a reputation in the Gangnam underworld for the kind of restrained precision that the residual memory of Dae-shik's body found. Daily, surreal. I had also acquired a phone number for Choi Soo-yeon, on which we had exchanged precisely 3 text messages, none of which had been about anything. I had also, in the second week, met the second of the heroines. Minji came to the Cutting Wind's office on a Saturday afternoon, alone, without notice, in a black coat and dark sunglasses. The security at the lobby, 3 Stage 4 soldiers, recognized her on sight and called up to my office before they had finished bowing. I told them to send her up. She came in. She sat down across the desk from me. She removed the sunglasses. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, Dae-shik. I said, Lady Park. She said, not Lady. Minji. I said, Minji. She said, I have, in the past 4 weeks, watched you build a thing across 19 blocks of a city that my family has been trying to clean up for 40 years. I said, I have noticed your family's efforts. She said, your operation is not, by my count, profitable. The rates you are charging are below what the residents would willingly pay for protection of this quality. I said, I am not in this for profit. She said, what are you in it for? I said, I am in it for the people whose daughters were being sold by the Iron Ribbon and the Steel Crane and the Yellow Fong. I am in it for the noodle shop. I am in it because the protection economy of the city is the kind of thing that has been allowed to exist for too long, and the city has been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to start dismantling it. I said, I am not interested in your family's permission. I am not interested in becoming part of your family's house. I am, however, very interested in the city not collapsing into a gang war between Hyunwoo and Taehyun in 5 months, because that war will, by the projections I have made, kill 300 civilians. I would like to prevent the war. I am open to suggestions on how to prevent it. I would like, if you have time, to hear yours. She studied me. She said, my father will want to meet you. I said, tell your father he is welcome to come to this office at his convenience. I will not, however, come to him. She did the small smile that the Manhwa had described as the smile she did when something amused her in a way she had not, until that moment, expected. She said, that is the most disrespectful thing anyone has said to my father in 8 years. I said, I will try to do better next time. She said, no, I think, for now, this is the right level of disrespect. She paused. She said, there is also a thing I want to ask. I said, ask. She said, at the cafe, 3 weeks ago, you said you owed Hyunwoo your meals. You said you were leaving the Black Serpent. She said, was that true? I said, every word. She said, are you also leaving him for me? It was the question that had, I now realized, been the entire reason she had come to my office without notice. The Park family's heiress, the heroine of the Manhwa, the woman the author had spent 600 chapters orbiting around. She had come to ask me, directly, in private, whether my refusal of Hyunwoo was a play for her. I said, very quietly, no, Minji. I am leaving him for myself. The way you, in the next few weeks, will leave him for yourself. She was quiet for a long moment. She said, I have not, yet, told him I am leaving. I said, I know. She said, how? I said, because, in the Manhwa, you do not tell him until chapter 28, when he does something that breaks the trust between you. The thing he does is something I would prefer he not do, because the woman it involves does not deserve it. I am, in the next 2 weeks, going to make sure he does not do it. After that, you will be the one who decides whether to leave him on your own terms or to stay. She said, which would you prefer? I said, I have no preference. You are not, Minji, a piece of a story. You are a person. I am asking you to be a person and to make your own decision, in your own time, for your own reasons. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, you keep saying Manhwa. I said, it is a long explanation. She said, I have time. I said, I will tell you. Not today. She said, when? I said, when you have decided what you are going to do about Hyunwoo. After that, I will tell you everything. She said, that is a hostage exchange. I said yes. She did the small smile again. She said, my father is going to be very interested in you, Dae-shik. She put her sunglasses back on. She stood up. At the door, she said, I will come back. She left. I sat at the desk for a long time. In the office's outer room, my new secretary, a former Iron Ribbon soldier named Min-soo who had, after the bar incident, asked very politely to be allowed to stay, knocked once. I said, come in. He said, boss, there is a situation. The Lee family's people are downstairs. They asked for you. They said it was an introduction. I closed my eyes. Lee Tae-hyun, the hero, the man who, in the original timeline, would have, on a Wednesday in October, stood over Go Dae-shik's body on a Gangnam sidewalk and lit a cigarette he did not smoke. I opened my eyes. I said, send them up. I straightened the wooden practice sword at my back. The introduction took 38 minutes. It was the politest of any meeting I had taken in the 4 weeks. Tae-hyun did not come in person. He had sent 2 retainers, both stage 6 cultivators, star will rank, which was 3 full stages above me, with an envelope. The envelope contained a handwritten letter on white paper, in Tae-hyun's own hand. The letter was 3 sentences long. The letter read, I have heard interesting things about you. I would like to meet. Choose a time and a place. I will come. I read the letter twice. I wrote a reply. The reply read, tomorrow at 5. The noodle shop on the 3rd block of Gwangnoro. I recommend the red bean buns. Halmoni Kong has been making them for 40 years. I gave the reply to the senior retainer. He bowed. They left. I sat at the desk. I looked at the empty chair where Min-ji had sat. I thought about everything that had moved in 4 weeks. I thought about everything that was about to move in the next 24 hours. I called Tae-ho into the office. I told him to be at the noodle shop tomorrow at 4. To stay across the street. To do nothing unless I made a specific gesture I described to him. I told him, also, that if I did make the gesture and he came, he should come prepared to die. Tae-ho did not flinch. He said, yes, boss. He left. I sat at the desk. The sun was setting outside the window. I had, in the morning, climbed 19 blocks of city into a protection operation that none of the noble houses had been able to dismantle in 40 years. In the morning, I would meet the hero of the manhwa over red bean buns. I went home. I slept. I dreamed of nothing. Lee Tae-hyun arrived at the noodle shop at 4:58. He came alone. He came on foot. He wore a plain dark gray sweater and black trousers, and he carried no visible weapon, and his cultivation aura was, as the manhwa had described it, the aura of a man who had spent years deliberately suppressing his own signature so that he could walk through a city without breaking the air around him. He was 26. He was, in person, slightly less tall than the manhwa had drawn him, with the kind of face that the author had referred to in Chapter 1 as forgettable until you saw the eyes. The eyes were not forgettable. The eyes had read, on every page of the manhwa, as the eyes of a hunter. In person they read the same way. They were a flat, slightly cold brown, set under straight dark brows, with the small particular focus of a man who was, at all times, calculating 5 things and discarding 3 of them. He came in. The bell over the door rang. Halmoni Kong, behind the counter, looked up, and her face did the small thing that the manhwa had described in Chapter 42. The face of an old woman who has seen a particular customer many times and never said the customer's name. She brought us 2 bowls of tea and 2 red bean buns without asking. Tae-hyun sat down across from me. He looked at the buns. He looked at me. He said, in a quiet voice that did not carry, "You picked a good place." I said, "I know." He said, "She does not know who I am." I said, "She knows." "She doesn't say." He smiled, very briefly. It was a real smile. It was the small private smile the manhwa had described him doing only twice in 600 chapters. once when he had successfully arranged a difficult assassination, and once when he had read a letter from his sister. He said, Dae-shik, I wanted to meet you because of 3 things. He said, the first is that you took the iron ribbon in 11 seconds. I have, in the past 4 years, watched the iron ribbon resist absorption by every house in Gangnam. They survived because Yang Ki-hwan was, despite his other qualities, a competent organizer. I wanted to see the person who walked into his bar and turned him out. He said, the second is that you have, in 4 weeks, taken 19 blocks and refused to sell a single daughter. The protection economy of this city has been, for 40 years, an industry of slow harm. I have been working on the question of how to dismantle it without an open war. I had not, until you, considered the possibility that the answer was to insert a single new operator with the right ethics. He said, the third is that Hyun-woo invited me to his office 2 days ago to suggest that we should, jointly, eliminate you before you became a problem. He paused. He said, I came to ask you why I should not. I picked up my tea. I drank it. I set it down. I said, because if you do, you will discover, in the process, that the gangs of this city respond very poorly to coordinated noble house interventions against a popular operator. You will have, after my death, a gang war with 3 sides instead of 2. The third side will be every small operator in Gangnam who watched the iron ribbon get taken in 11 seconds and decided, quietly, that the cutting wind was the future. They will not be on your side. They will not be on Hyun-woo's side. They will be on their own side, which, after my death, will be ungovernable. I said, also, I do not think you actually want me dead. I think you wanted to meet, in person, the person Hyun-woo has decided to kill jointly with you, because you have not, in the past, agreed to a joint anything with Hyun-woo, and you are wondering what about me has changed his calculation. I said, I will tell you. Hyun-woo wants me dead because, 3 weeks ago in a private dining room, I refused his offer of a lieutenant position. He had not been refused since he was 19. He has not yet adjusted. I said, you have, I think, adjusted faster. I think you are sitting at this table because you have already decided not to kill me. You are here to find out what we are going to do instead. Taehyun was quiet for a long moment. He said, how do you know all this? I said, I have, separately, an unusual source of information. I will not, at this table, tell you what it is. I will tell you, eventually, when I tell Minji. His eyes did the small thing. He said, Minji. I said, she came to my office on Saturday. She has decided to leave Hyun-woo. She has not yet told him. He said, I see. I said, I am not in pursuit of her. I am not in pursuit of any of the named women you may have encountered in your social orbit. I am, for the moment, in pursuit of nothing except a city that does not have a gang war in 5 months. If, after that, certain women decide certain things, that is, for them, their decision. I am, however, not engineering it. He studied me. He said, you talk like a man who has read a book. I said, I have. He said, which book? I said, the same book Minji is going to want me to explain. I will explain it to both of you at the same time, when she is ready. He said, you are very confident, Dae-shik. I said, I have, in the past 6 months, climbed a mountain twice a day. Confidence is the only thing I have made room for. He picked up his bun. He bit into it. He chewed for a moment. He said, this is the best bun I have ever eaten. I said, I told you. He finished the bun. He drank his tea. He set the cup down. He stood up. He said, Dae-shik, I will not move against you. I will, in the next 2 weeks, tell Hyun-woo that I am not going to participate in his plan. He will not, after that, be able to come at you alone, because the math will not be in his favor and he will know it. He will then try other things. He said, when he tries the other things, you will be on your own. I am not going to ally with you. I am, for now, going to leave you to operate, and I am going to watch. He said, if, in 5 months, you have prevented the war, I will, at that point, owe you a favor. I do not give favors easily. I expect you will use it well. I said, thank you, Taehyun. He said, I will not see you again until then. He bowed slightly. He paid Halmoni Kong for both of our buns, despite my objection, with a single bill that was 4 times what the buns had cost. He left. I sat at the table for another 20 minutes. I ate the bun. I drank the tea. I thought about the city. Halmoni Kong came over. She refilled my tea. She said, in her small, dry voice, that one is dangerous. I said, yes, Halmoni. She said, more than the other one. I said yes. She said, but he likes the buns. I said yes. She said, that is something. I sat at the table until sundown. The next 6 weeks moved fast. Hyunwoo, after Taehyun's withdrawal, tried, as predicted, other things. The first thing he tried was an assassin contract through a third-party broker, a Stage 6 killer named Bae Sung-il, who specialized in cross-house elimination jobs. Bae Sung-il came at me in an underground parking garage on a Tuesday night, with a chain weapon and a Starwell signature, and he was, by any honest measure, the most dangerous opponent I had faced in this life. He was also, by his form, a man who had never fought someone with the wind blade form's movement variation, and the fight took 2 minutes and 20 seconds. And at the end of it, Bae Sung-il was on his back on the parking garage floor with both his arms broken at the elbow and his chain weapon wrapped twice around his own neck. And he was conscious, and he was, very politely, agreeing to refund Hyunwoo's contract and retire to a small island in the south. I let him go. The second thing Hyunwoo tried was a frame-up. He arranged, through a paid press contact, for a tabloid to publish a piece linking the cutting wind to a recent string of disappearances in Gangbuk. The piece ran on a Thursday morning. By Thursday evening, the press contact had, in the words of a phone call from Taeho, withdrawn his statement under pressure from his own editor, and the editor had run a correction at the bottom of page 6. I did not have to do anything for this to happen. The disappearances in Gangbuk had, in fact, been traced by an independent journalist who specialized in cultivation crimes and who had been waiting for 2 years for someone in the underworld to give her a real story to the Black Serpent's own Western branch. The journalist's name was Yoon Deun. She came to my office on the Saturday after the correction ran. She was 25. She was a member of the Yoon family, one of the older noble houses, which had been quietly losing influence for 2 generations because the family head had refused to engage in the protection economy. She had been disowned for becoming a journalist instead of a cultivator. She was, by her own cultivation, stage 5 low. The family's training had stuck, even after the disowning, and by her instincts, the sharpest investigator I had met in either of my 2 lives. She wore a brown coat. She did not sit down when she came in. She put a folder on my desk. She said, I have been working on the Black Serpent's Western branch for 18 months. I have, in that folder, evidence sufficient to indict 11 of their captains under the cultivation crime statute. The evidence has, until last week, been useless because no prosecutor in Seoul would take a case against the Black Serpent without a counterweight in the underworld. As of last week, you are the counterweight. She said, I am giving you the folder. I am asking you, in return, for one thing. I said, ask. She said, a press credential. With the cutting wind. Permanent. I want to be the only journalist in the city who is allowed inside your operation. I want exclusive access. I want, at the end of this, whatever this is, to be the one who writes the book. I said, why? She said, because my father, 6 years ago, was the first noble house head who refused to engage in the protection economy. He was killed for it. I was told it was an accident. It was not an accident. The men who killed him are in that folder. She paused. She said, I am not asking you to kill them. I am asking you to use the folder. I said, I will use the folder. I said, you have the credential. Permanent. Effective immediately. She bowed. She put on her hat. She left. The folder was the lever that opened the next phase. I gave the folder to Soo-yeon, who gave it to her uncle, the head of the Choi family. The Choi house had, for 2 generations, been waiting for an excuse to publicly side against the Black Serpent. The folder, combined with Yoon Deun's byline coverage, was the excuse. Within 10 days, the Choi house had moved formal cultivation crime charges against 11 Black Serpent captains. Within 12 days, the charges were national news. Within 15 days, 6 of the 11 had fled the country, and the Black Serpent's western branch had collapsed. Hyun-woo, in the Manhwa, had survived the western branch's collapse only because he had personally executed 3 of his own captains as a show of distance from the operation. He had done this in Chapter 31, on screen, in a way that the manhwa's author had used to demonstrate the depth of his cold. In this timeline, he did not get the chance, because by the time he had decided to do the same thing, on day 16 of the western branch's collapse, the cutting wind had absorbed the western branch's territory in a clean, coordinated, 3-day operation. I did the operation myself, with Taeho running the logistics and 7 of the 8 other lieutenants leading the field teams. The operation involved approximately 200 small skirmishes in alleys and basements and convenience store backrooms across the western districts. The cutting wind took losses: 8 soldiers wounded, 2 killed, one of them a young man named Min-soo who I had personally recruited from the noodle shop, and whose death I attended the funeral of 2 days later in the family plot in a hillside cemetery north of the city, and where I gave the eulogy, which was the first eulogy I had ever given in either of my lives. By the end of the operation, the cutting wind controlled 47 blocks. It was, by membership, the 3rd largest cultivation operation in Seoul. It was, by reputation, the cleanest. It was, by every measurable signal, the thing Hyun-woo had spent his entire adult life building the Black Serpent into, except that I had built it in 8 weeks, and I had not, in the process, sold a single daughter. Hyun-woo, by the count of his available tools, had run out of things to try alone. He went, in the 7th week, to the 3rd thing. The 3rd thing was the Heavenly Temple. I should explain about the Heavenly Temple. The Heavenly Temple was the cultivation world's official religious institution, a Buddhist-inflected sect that, in the Manhwa, served as a kind of moral arbiter for inter-house disputes. The temple was led by a council of saintesses and saints, each of whom held a spirit manifest cultivation or higher, stage 6 minimum, with several star wheel and 1 rumored sovereign. The temple had not, in the past 40 years, intervened directly in any matter of the protection economy, because the temple's official position was that the protection economy was a regrettable but acceptable feature of mortal society, and that the temple's purpose was higher. This position had, in the Manhwa, never been challenged. In this timeline, on day 43 of the western branch's collapse, Hyun-woo's family, which had 2 of its eldest sons in the temple's lower ranks, petitioned the council to formally censure the cutting wind for destabilizing the protection economy through unsanctioned absorption operations. The temple agreed to hear the petition. The hearing was scheduled for the following Sunday. I was summoned to attend. I came on Sunday morning, alone, in a plain dark suit, with the wooden practice sword inside my coat. The Heavenly Temple's main hall was in the north of the city, on the slope of Bukhansan, accessible by a long flight of 1,008 stone steps. I climbed the steps in 19 minutes. The temple guards at the top, 2 spirit manifest cultivators in saffron robes, bowed when I arrived and gestured me through the main gate. The hall was a long stone chamber with a high wooden ceiling and a council bench at the far end. 11 saintesses and saints sat at the bench. Behind me, on the visitor benches, sat the petitioners, Hyun-woo's family heads in formal dress, with Hyun-woo himself behind them, and a small contingent of the Choi family, including Seon, who had insisted on attending as a neutral observer. I walked up the aisle to the center of the chamber. I stopped at the petitioner's stone. The saintess at the center of the council was a woman I had read about in the Manhwa once, in a single scene in Chapter 81. Her name was Lady Seo Yirim. She was 28. She was, by the Manhwa's account, the youngest saintess in the temple's history, having broken into the Star Wheel realm at 26. She was, also, the only member of the council whose vote on any given matter was unpredictable, because she was the only member who had not been born into the noble house hierarchy that the temple had spent 40 years quietly serving. She read the petition. She set it down. She looked at me. She said, in a voice that was perfectly even and perfectly young, "Operator of the cutting wind, state your defense." I said, "Lady Seo, I do not have a defense because I have not committed a violation. I have, in the past 8 weeks, displaced 11 black serpent captains from territories they were illegally occupying. The prosecutorial cases against those captains were filed by the Choi House under the cultivation crime statute, and 7 of them have already been convicted in absentia. The displacement was not a destabilization of the protection economy. It was an enforcement of it." I said, "The petition before this council is not, in fact, a petition against the cutting wind. It is a petition by a noble house that has lost 47 blocks of illegal revenue to retain the privilege of recovering that revenue through whatever means it pleases. The petition is, in its substance, a request that the temple bless the protection economy by punishing the operator who has reduced it." I said, "I will not waste this council's time arguing about whether such a blessing is appropriate. I will say only that the temple has, for 40 years, declined to intervene in the protection economy because the economy was outside the temple's official purview. If the temple chooses, today, to intervene against the only operator who has ever reduced the economy, then the temple will, by that intervention, formally declare that its purview extends to protecting the economy, not regulating it." I said, "That is a position I will not, today, contest. But it is a position the temple, after today, will own." I bowed. I stepped back from the petitioner's stone. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Lady Seo Yirim said, "Operator, go. Do you have any further statement?" I said, "No, Lady Seo." She said, "The council will deliberate." She stood up. The other 10 council members stood up. They left the chamber by a door at the back. I stood at the petitioner's stone for the 46 minutes of their deliberation. I did not, in that 46 minutes, look back at Hyunwoo. I did not need to. I could feel his chi behind me, tight and rising, the way the chi of a man who has just heard his own legal strategy described back to him with painful precision rises. The council came back. Lady Seo, at the center, did not sit down. She remained standing. She read from a small folded paper. She said, "The council has considered the petition. The council has determined that the operations of the cutting wind in the past 8 weeks do not, in their substance, constitute a violation of any rule the temple is empowered to enforce. The petition is dismissed." She paused. She said, "The council also wishes to issue a separate, unrelated statement. The statement is that the temple's traditional position of non-intervention in the protection economy has, in light of recent prosecutions filed by the Choi family under the cultivation crime statute, been determined to require review. A formal review committee will be convened within the month. The committee will, among other things, examine the question of whether certain practices currently common in the economy fall, in fact, outside the temple's purview." She looked, very briefly, at me. She said, "The committee will be led by myself." She said, "This council is adjourned." The other saintesses and saints filed out. The Hyunwoo family delegation rose and left, in tense silence. Hyunwoo himself did not leave with them. He stood at his bench, watching me, until Soo-yeon's father, who had not previously been at the hearing, but who had appeared in the back row sometime during the deliberation, came over and put a hand on Hyunwoo's shoulder and said something I could not hear, after which Hyunwoo, very slowly, walked out. I turned to leave. Lady Seo Yirim was at the petitioner's stone. She had come down from the bench. She said, "Operator, go. I would like a private word." I said, "Of course, Lady Seo." She walked me to a small antechamber off the main hall. She closed the door. She poured 2 cups of tea from a small pot that was, by its chi signature, warm by some method that was not heat. She handed me a cup. She said, "That was a clever speech." I said, "It was not, particularly a speech. It was an observation." She said, "It was clever. The temple does not, ordinarily, get spoken to that way." I said, "I apologize if I gave offense." She said, "You did not. I am, in fact, grateful. The temple has been waiting for someone to give us an excuse to do what I have just announced. You provided one. The committee I will lead has, in fact, been my own personal project for 3 years. I have not, until today, had the political opening to convene it." She paused. She said, "I would like to invite you, when the committee begins its work, to provide testimony." I said I will. She said, "Thank you." She drank her tea. Then she said, in a slightly different voice, "There is a thing I would like to ask, off the record." I said, "Ask." She said, "How? Exactly, do you know to speak about the protection economy in the language of regulatory review? Most cultivation operators of your age, and there are not many of your age, since most operators rise more slowly, do not speak this language. They speak the language of personal vendetta and noble house pride. You speak the language of administrative jurisprudence. It is not a language one picks up." I said, "I had, in my previous life, an unusual education." She said, "Previous life?" I said, "It is a long explanation." She said, "I will hear it when you are ready to tell." She set down her tea. She bowed, very slightly. She said, "I will see you at the committee. Until then, operator, go." She left. I drank the rest of my tea slowly. I had, that morning, by my count, acquired the 3rd saintess of the heavenly temple as a sympathetic outside force, secured a public dismissal of the Black Serpent's last administrative leverage, and triggered a regulatory review that would, if it went well, dismantle the protection economy of Seoul over the next 2 years. I had also, I noted, been told twice in one morning that the temple's most powerful young saintess would, eventually, want to hear my whole story. The Park family's heiress had said the same thing. So had the city's only honest cultivation journalist. I was beginning, very quietly, to develop a problem. I left the temple. I went home. I did not, that night, dream. The week after the temple hearing, I met the actress. It was not a meeting I had arranged. I had been, that Tuesday, at a charity benefit dinner that Min-ji had asked me to attend with her. The dinner was a public event, a fundraiser for cultivation orphan education programs across the city, hosted at a venue in Yongsan, with approximately 300 guests, including most of the noble house heirs and a handful of celebrities. Min-ji had wanted me there, she had said, because the dinner was the first public event since the temple hearing, and she wanted the noble houses to see that the Park family was, formally, allied with the cutting wind. We were not, formally, allied. But the perception was useful, and Min-ji had decided, in the past 2 weeks, that she enjoyed the kind of meetings I attended and would, going forward, attend more of them. We arrived at the venue at 7. The room was full. I was wearing a dark suit. Min-ji was wearing a deep green dress and the small jade pin of the Park house. Soo-yeon was there, in dark gray, drinking water with the same dry mouth she always drank water with. Yoon De-eun was there, with her press credentials, taking notes in the corner. Taeho was downstairs in the lobby with 3 other lieutenants, in case. The actress was at the bar. Her name was Kim Ji-hye. She was 27. She was, by the public reckoning, the most photographed woman in Korea, a film actress whose 3 big releases over the past 4 years had grossed more than the GDP of 2 small Pacific Island nations, and whose face was, at any given moment, on 3 billboards within walking distance of where I was standing. She had not, in the Manhwa, ever met Dae-shik. She had, in the Manhwa, been a footnote in chapter 412, a celebrity who had attended a charity event Lee Tae-hyun also attended, who who had spoken with him for 90 seconds, and who had never appeared again. The author had used her to demonstrate Taehyun's social pull. She was, in this timeline, standing at the bar in a black dress, drinking a single glass of champagne, watching a man harass a young waitress. The man was not Hyunwoo. The man was a minor heir of the Yang family, a third son with a stage 5 high cultivation and an established reputation for the kind of harassment that the protection economy had, for 40 years, made acceptable in Korean public life. He had cornered the waitress between the bar and a service door. He was, by every visible indicator, 3 seconds away from doing the thing the protection economy had taught him he could do. I saw it. So did Ji-hai. Ji-hai moved first. She set her champagne glass down on the bar. She walked across the floor with the long, efficient steps of a person who had been a dancer in her teens and a fight choreographer's regular collaborator since her early 20s. She arrived at the harasser's elbow as he was reaching to grab the waitress's arm. She stopped his hand by stepping on his foot, hard, with a heel, and saying, in a voice that did not carry beyond the bar's immediate circle but did, with great precision, carry within it. Young, I have been told for 10 years that I am supposed to ignore men like you. I am, tonight, choosing not to. Move your hand, or I will move it for you. Yang did not move his hand. He turned, slowly, with the slowness of a stage 5 high cultivator who was not, by training, used to being given orders by women in cocktail dresses. He said, Ji-hai, you are out of your weight class. He raised his other hand, the chi gathering visibly along the knuckles in a stage 5 strike pattern, and aimed it at her face. I was 4 meters away. I crossed it in the same quarter second the wind blade form's movement variation had been giving me for 2 months. I caught Yang's wrist before the strike landed. I twisted the wrist 90 degrees against the joint. The chi in his knuckles dissipated. The bones in his wrist did not break. I had decided, in the half-second before contact, that breaking the wrist in a room of 300 witnesses was a step too far, but the wrist sprained badly enough that Yang would not be using it for the rest of the week. He went down to one knee. The bar, which had been a small private incident in a larger room, became, very suddenly, the center of attention of 300 guests. I said, in a normal voice, Yang, apologize to the lady. Then apologize to the waitress. Then leave. Yang looked up at me. The Yang heir was not, by family or by training, accustomed to being given instructions by an unaffiliated operator with no noble title. His face did the small thing his family's face did when it was being publicly disrespected. He stood up. He pulled his wrist out of my grip. I let him, and he took a step back. He drew, with his left hand, a short cultivation knife from inside his jacket. It was a private weapon, not registered, not licensed for public carry, and the room would, by every standard of the cultivation regulatory framework, find his use of it unjustifiable. He came at me with the knife. I did not move my feet. I tilted my upper body 15 degrees to the right as the knife came in, let the blade pass within 2 centimeters of my ribs, and brought my right elbow down on the back of his knife arm in a single short strike at the calibrated weight Baekhyun had drilled into me for non-lethal disarmament. His arm dropped. The knife came loose. I caught it before it hit the floor. I held it up so the room could see. I said, Yang, you have, in front of 300 witnesses, drawn an unregistered weapon on an unarmed operator in a public charity venue. The Cultivation Regulatory Committee, which begins its work this month under Lady Seo Yirim, will be very interested in the record of tonight. I said apologize, or leave. Either is acceptable. He left. He left without apologizing, which was its own form of public confession. The room broke into the small murmur of 300 well-dressed people who had just witnessed something they would, all of them, be telling their household staffs about by morning. I turned to Ji-hai. I handed her the knife. I said, I believe this is now evidence. She took the knife. She said, very dryly, thank you, operator, go. I said, You know my name. She said, I know every name in this room tonight. It is my job. She said, I have been waiting for some time to meet you. I did not expect it to be at the bar of a charity dinner with a young sprain on the floor. I said, I did not either. She said, I would like to give you my number. I would like, eventually, to discuss with you a project I have been developing for the past 2 years. The project is adjacent to the work you are doing. I will not, tonight, take more of your time, but at your convenience. I said, at my convenience, Miss Kim. She handed me a card. I put the card in my pocket. She bowed slightly. She walked away. Min-ji, from across the room, was looking at me with an expression I had not, in our 7 meetings to date, seen on her before. It was an expression that was very still, very assessing, and contained, in its core, a small, precise amusement. Soo-yeon, 2 paces behind her, was making no expression at all. Yoon Do-eun, in the corner, was writing very fast. I thought, in a small, careful voice that no one in the room could hear. I have, by my count, a problem. The problem became, over the next 4 weeks, a more defined kind of problem. The problem was not, exactly, the women. The women were, each in their own way, conducting themselves with great propriety. Min-ji visited my office twice a week, ostensibly for consultations on the cutting wind's continuing absorption of small operators in the southern districts, and never once raised the question of whether she had, in fact, broken off her engagement to Hyun-woo. She had, I would later learn, broken it off on the Monday after the noodle shop meeting with Taehyun. She had not told me. She had not told Hyun-woo, either. Hyun-woo had found out from a mutual cousin 3 days later, and had taken the news, according to the cousin's report, in the silent way Hyun-woo took news that did not match his planning. Soo-yeon visited my office once a week, ostensibly to relay updates from her uncle the Choi House head on the progression of the Black Serpent prosecutions, and never once mentioned the cafe scene from Chapter 16. She did, however, in the 3rd week, begin staying for tea after the updates were delivered, and on the 4th week she remained for 90 minutes, and we did not, for 90 minutes, discuss the prosecutions. Yoon Do-eun moved her press credential into the office and began working from the small desk I had set up for her in the corner of my outer reception, on the grounds that the news cycle had become uncomfortably close to real time. She came to work at 9. She left at 8. She drank coffee with me in the late afternoons, after Min-ji had left and before Soo-yeon arrived, and on the 22nd day of her residency, she told me, very dryly, that this was not exactly the journalistic distance she had been taught at her family's school, and that she did not particularly mind. Co Yirim, the saintess, sent me 3 letters across the 4 weeks. The first letter was a formal invitation to provide testimony at the Regulatory Review Committee's first session. The second was a less formal note thanking me for the testimony. The third was a personal handwritten letter, on her personal stationery, in which she wrote that she had, in the course of researching the committee's work, read every published account of the Cutting Winds operations and had come to the conclusion that the operator was either the most strategically gifted social reformer in the cultivation world or the most patient assassin she had ever read about. She wrote that she wished, when the committee's first phase was complete, to know which. Ji-hai called once. She invited me to dinner. I declined, on the grounds of work. She called again 2 weeks later. She invited me to dinner. I declined again, on the grounds of work. She called a 3rd time. I accepted, on the grounds that declining a 3rd time would have been, by my own assessment, a kind of cowardice I did not, anymore, want to allow myself. We had dinner on a Thursday at a small Italian place in Itaewon. She told me about her project. The project was a film. The film was a thinly fictionalized account of the Yoon family patriarch's murder. The man Yoon Do-eun had told me about in my office 2 months earlier, and the cover-up by the Black Serpent's Western branch. The film had a script. The film had financing. The film had not, before tonight, had a way to ensure that the Black Serpent's surviving leadership would not, on its release, simply burn the studio. She wanted, she said, the cutting wind's quiet endorsement. I agreed. She said, I would also, separately, like to know what kind of man you are. Because the dossier I have on you is strange. I said, I will tell you the dossier is correct in its facts and incomplete in its interpretations. She said, I would like to know the interpretations. I said, not tonight, Ji-hai. She said, when? I said, at the end of all this. When the city is settled. She said, I will hold you to that. She did not press. The problem, then, was not the women. The problem was that the women had, without coordinating, begun to act, in their separate spheres, as if they were part of a single coalition whose purpose I had not yet been told. Minji had, in week 3, formally rerouted approximately 12 million won a month of the Park family's discretionary education budget into the cutting wind's protective work on the eastern blocks. Suyun had, in week 4, gotten her uncle to send 4 mid-foundation cultivators of the wind blade lineage to the cutting wind's office on temporary attachment to train my lieutenants. Yoon Deun had, in week 4, written a long profile piece on the cutting wind that ran on the front page of the Hankiori and that did, in passing, mention the operator's remarkable focus and self-discipline, in a way that, to anyone who knew the language of Korean newspaper profile writing, was an editorial endorsement so total it nearly counted as marriage paperwork. Co Yirim had, in week 5, recommended me by name to the Hunters Association's executive board as a possible candidate for a newly created liaison role between the association and the cutting wind. Ji-hai had begun, that same week, casually mentioning the project in interviews, and naming me in the casual mentions. I had not, by my own action, encouraged any of this. I had, however, allowed it to continue, because every individual instance was, by its own logic, useful to the work of preventing the gang war. The park money was useful. The wind blade trainers were useful. The newspaper profile was useful. The Hunters Association liaison role would be extremely useful. The film, when it released, would be useful. The problem was that, by the end of the 5th week, the cutting wind had, on its books, a quiet informal alliance with 5 different powerful women across 5 different domains of Seoul's institutional life. The Park Noble House, the Choi Noble House, the city's leading cultivation journalist, the youngest saintess on the Heavenly Temples Council, and the most photographed actress in Korea, and the alliance had, by then, been observed by Kim Hyun-woo. He had been observing for some time. He came to my office, alone, without notice, on the Tuesday of the 6th week. I was at my desk reading the morning's intake reports. Tae-ho, in the outer office, knocked once and said, Boss, Kim Hyun-woo is here. Alone. I said, send him in. Hyun-woo came in. He sat down across the desk from me. He did not, this time, have the easy slouch of the private dining room. His shoulders were straight. His face was the face of a man who had decided that whatever conversation we were about to have was, by his own ranking of conversations, important. He said, Dae-shik. I said, Boss. He said, I had thought, after the temple hearing, that we were finished. I was incorrect. I said yes. He said, I have, in the past 3 weeks, watched you assemble, quietly, without announcement, possibly without intent, the most consequential and formal alliance in the recent history of this city. Park, Choi, Yoon, Temple, Press, Film. Each of those alone is a thing I would have spent 4 years arranging. You have done all of them in 6 weeks. He said, I am not, tonight, here to threaten you. I am here to ask you a question. He said, what is your endgame? I considered the question for a long moment. I said, my endgame, Hyun-woo, was always to not die. 6 months ago, on a mattress in a one-room studio in Mapo, I had a piece of information that told me I would die in October in a gang war between you and Taehyun. My only purpose, then, was to become strong enough to refuse the death. I said, I am, now, strong enough to refuse the death. The gang war is also, by my count, no longer going to happen. The black serpent is too damaged to fight one. The white tigers no longer need to fight one. The city has, without realizing it, moved past the war. I said, my endgame, as of tonight, is unclear to me. I have not, yet, decided what to do with the rest of the life I no longer have to spend dying. I said, I am open to suggestions. Hyun-woo studied me for a long, careful moment. He said, you are telling me that you do not know what you want. I said, I am telling you I have, until very recently, not been the kind of person who was allowed to want anything. I have not, yet, learned how. He said, that is surprisingly honest of you. I said, I am tired, boss. I have been doing this for 6 months. I will sleep when I can. He said, I have a suggestion. I said, ask. He said, leave the city. Take the cutting wind with you. There are other cities in Korea. There are other countries. Take what you have built and go somewhere it will not collide with what I have built and what Taehyun has built. We can coexist at distance. We cannot coexist in the same city. I said, no. He said, then we have a problem. I said, yes. He said, Taehyun has, in the past week, met with me twice. He has agreed, in principle, to a joint operation against the cutting wind. The terms of the joint operation are still being finalized. I am not, exactly, telling you this as a warning. I am telling you as a courtesy. I said, I appreciate the courtesy. He said, I would prefer this not happen, Dae-shik. I would prefer it not happen because I have, in the past 6 months, developed a respect for you that I have not, in the past 5 years, developed for any of the other operators in this city. I am not sentimental, but I am, on this point, regretful in advance. I said, I understand. He stood up. He said, in 3 weeks, then. I said, in 3 weeks. He left. I sat at the desk for a long time. Then I called my 8 lieutenants into the conference room. I told them what was coming. I told them they had 3 weeks to prepare. I told them, also, that any of them who wanted to leave, to take their cut of the operations reserves and walk away, could do so tonight, with my blessing and a clean parting bonus. None of them left. Taeho said, in his quiet voice, on behalf of all 8, boss. We are in. I said, thank you. I went home. I did not, that night, dream. The 3 weeks went very fast. In the first week, I trained. I trained 8 hours a day with the wind blade form, with the wooden practice sword Bak Hyun had given me, with the Choi House cultivators Soo Yun's uncle had attached to my operation. I pushed my cultivation, in the first week, from stage 5 high into stage 6 low. Spirit manifest. The realm at which a cultivator first projected chi as a visible external manifestation. The realm at which I would, against a foundation realm opponent like Hyun-woo or Taehyun, no longer be overmatched. In the second week, I planned. The plan was simple in its outline and very detailed in its execution. The plan was, when the joint operation came, I would not defend the cutting wind's office. I would let them come into the office. I would let them, in fact, surround the office. I would meet them in the office's central courtyard, which was, by deliberate architectural choice when I had bought the building, a long open stone yard with high walls on all 4 sides and 1 entrance. I would meet them alone. I would, in the central courtyard, fight every member of the joint operation, 1 tier at a time, until I had either defeated all of them or I had been defeated. I would not, by the terms of my own internal commitment, kill anyone unnecessarily. I would, by the same terms, kill anyone who proved, in the fighting, to require killing. The plan was, in its essence, the same plan Bak Hyun had drilled into me on the mountain. You climb. You climb until the climb is done. In the 3rd week, I waited. The joint operation came on a Wednesday at 1 in the afternoon. The choice of timing was deliberate. The original gang war, in the Manhwa, had occurred on a Wednesday in October at 1 in the afternoon. Hyun-woo and Taehyun had, together, decided to honor the original date. It was, in its way, a small piece of respect. The forces that arrived were larger than I had anticipated. I had anticipated Hyunwoo's Black Serpent, 80 soldiers, 12 lieutenants, 2 foundation captains, and Hyunwoo himself, approximately 150 fighters. I had anticipated Taehyun's White Tigers, 60 soldiers, 10 lieutenants, 3 foundation captains, and Taehyun himself, approximately 90 fighters. I had not anticipated the third group. The third group was, by its banners, an alliance of 4 smaller gangs, the Yellow Fong, the Blue Sky, the Yang Family Guard, and a previously fringe operation called the Red Iron Coalition that had been, until very recently, defunct. The 4 gangs had, in the past month, been quietly assembled by an intermediary I could not, from the office's roof, identify. The 4 gangs added another 120 fighters to the field. Total opposition force, approximately 360 fighters. In the central courtyard. Against me. I stood at the courtyard center as the first wave came over the walls. In my chest, the chi I had spent 6 months awakening pulsed once, very calmly, very evenly. I drew the wooden practice sword from my coat. I said, quietly, to the courtyard, "Come." The first wave was 84 soldiers, a mix of the Black Serpent's low ranks and the 4 smaller gangs' rank and file, sent up the walls and through the gate at the same moment. They were, on average, staged for cultivators. Their tactics were the tactics of bulk infantry: overwhelm, drown, individually mediocre, but collectively crushing. I did not let them collectively crush me. I moved. I used the wind blade form's movement variation in long sliding arcs across the courtyard stone, never standing in one place for more than 2 heartbeats, drawing the wave around me into the kind of disorganized chase that turned individual soldiers into individual targets. I struck with the wooden sword, with the wind blade form's compressed chi blades, with open palm strikes that broke ribs through cheap cultivator vests. 8 strikes a second, by Taeho's later count from the office's roof cameras. Each strike non-lethal. Each strike calibrated to take a soldier out of the fight for the rest of the day. I broke knees. I broke wrists. I broke collarbones. I broke jaws when soldiers gave me the angle. The first wave fell in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. 84 soldiers. On the stone of the courtyard. Conscious. Bleeding. Out of the fight. The second wave came over the walls before the first had fully stopped moving. The second wave was the gang's middle ranks, 60 Stage 5 soldiers, with 5 Stage 5 high lieutenants leading them, including 2 wind blade form practitioners from the Yang family's training school, whose form I recognized from Bak Hyun's old descriptions. The Yang wind blades came at me first. They came in the synchronized double strike pattern Yang school had developed 3 generations earlier, a long-range compression strike from the senior partner, paired with a short-range close cut from the junior. The pattern was elegant. It was also, by Bak Hyun's later refinements, predictable. I caught the senior partner's compression strike with the wooden sword, redirected the chi blade along the sword's length, and redirected it back at the junior partner's close cut at exactly the angle that intercepted his strike at its midpoint. Both strikes collided. Both wind blade practitioners staggered. I closed the distance to the senior in the same quarter-second the movement variation always gave me, and I broke his sternum with a single open palm strike. He went down. The junior, recovering, drew a steel blade from inside his jacket and came at me with the kind of horizontal sweep his school taught for cleanup work. I let the sweep pass. I caught his wrist on the backswing. I broke the wrist. I broke the elbow on the same line. I broke the shoulder on the same line. He went down. I turned to the second wave's remaining 58 soldiers. I let my chi, for the first time in the fight, rise visibly. The spirit manifest aura, the visible external projection of Stage 6 cultivation, came up around me as a thin white-blue halo that the Manhwa had described, in its later chapters, as the kind of chi projection that made lesser cultivators rethink their participation in a fight. 23 of the second wave's remaining soldiers turned around and went back over the walls. 35 did not. I cut through them in another 2 minutes and 10 seconds. The wooden sword cracked in the 18th strike against the cultivation-augmented spine of a soldier I had not, by his armor, recognized as a hidden stage 5 high. I dropped the wooden sword. I picked up a steel blade from the floor, one of the dropped weapons of the first wave, and I finished the second wave with the steel blade in my right hand and the wind blade form on my left. 6 minutes total. 144 enemy soldiers down. The third wave was the captains. There were 5 of them. 3 Black Serpent Foundation captains, 2 White Tiger Foundation captains. All 5 came together in a coordinated entry from all 4 corners of the courtyard, with the 5th dropping from the roof above me. I had, on the mountain, planned for this. I dropped to one knee at the center of the courtyard. I planted the steel sword point down into the stone between my feet. I closed my eyes for 1 heartbeat. I let my spirit manifest chi pulse outward in the full radius of its projection, the kind of pulse that, in the Manhwa, had been described as the moment a stage 6 cultivator commanded an arena. The pulse pushed the 4 ground-level captains back by a meter each. The 5th, dropping from the roof, took the pulse directly in the chest at the moment of his descent and changed direction in midair, not by his own choice, by the pulse's redirection, and landed 3 meters off his intended target, on his back, with his weapon dropped beside him. I opened my eyes. I stood up. I picked up the steel sword. I went after the foreground captains. The fight with the captains took 8 minutes. They were Foundation Realm. They were trained. They were, individually, the strongest opponents I had faced in this life. They were also, by their coordination, not actually practiced at fighting together. The joint operation had been organized at the lieutenant and up level only in the past week, and the captains had not, until today, drilled as a 5-man team. I took them apart one at a time. I used the wind blade form's compression blades to redirect their attacks into each other. I let 2 of the Black Serpent captains, in the 4th minute, strike each other across the back with their own chi blades, and both of them folded simultaneously. I closed on the 3rd Black Serpent captain in the 5th minute and broke his sternum with the same open palm strike I had used on the Yang School senior, except calibrated heavier, because the 3rd captain was Foundation Realm. He went down. I caught the 1st White Tiger captain in the 6th minute as he attempted a long-range pillar strike I had read about in Chapter 41 of the Manhwa, and I redirected the pillar back into him with a compressed wind blade reflection that broke 3 of his ribs and his right knee. He went down. The 2nd White Tiger captain, seeing this, did the small calculation a Foundation cultivator does at the edge of his survival and dropped his weapon, and I let him drop it, and he sat down on the stones with his hands up. The 5th captain, the one from the roof, was getting up. I looked at him. He sat back down. 8 minutes, for captains down, 1 surrendered, plus 144 soldiers from the earlier waves. I had, by my own count, used up roughly 40% of my available chi reserves. The 4th wave came. The 4th wave was Hyunwoo and Taehyun. They came in through the courtyard's main gate, on foot, side by side, in matching gray combat coats. They had, by the look of their chi auras, agreed to fight me jointly under a precise protocol. Neither would interfere with the other's attacks, but both would attack continuously, on alternating 1-second beats, until I was down. They were both mid-Foundation Realm. Together, by the cooperation, they functionally tested at Spirit Manifest mid. I was Spirit Manifest low, slightly above the threshold. By any honest reading of the cultivation arithmetic, this was a fight I was supposed to lose. I had not, on the mountain, planned for this with arithmetic. I had planned for it with one assumption. The assumption was that, in the moment they began to lose, they would, by their cooperation protocol, hesitate to break the protocol. And the hesitation was the only opening I would need. They engaged at the same moment. Hyunwoo opened with the Black Serpent House's signature serpent strike. a long whipping chi line that imitated the movement of a striking snake, lethal at any point along its arc, very difficult to defend against because the arc itself was unpredictable. Tae-hyun, simultaneously, opened with the White Tiger's claw form, a four-line compressed strike that aimed for 4 separate points on my body at the same moment. I caught the serpent strike with the wind blade form's redirection on the wooden sword's hilt. The sword itself was broken, but the hilt still functioned as a chi-conducting handle, and I let the claw form's 4 lines pass me by, 2 on each side, by stepping inside the strike's geometry at the exact moment of its convergence. Both attacks missed. Tae-hyun adjusted. He came in with the close-range follow-up. The White Tiger form had been developed to chain off the claw. Hyun-woo, on the alternate beat, came in with the serpent's second arc. I had, on the mountain, drilled this exact pattern with Bak-hyun for the last 28 days of my training. Bak-hyun, of course, had not known I was training for Hyun-woo and Tae-hyun specifically. He had, however, known the Black Serpent's serpent strike and the White Tiger's claw form by reputation, and he had, because he was a master who had spent 40 years studying the dominant forms of his era, drilled me on the defenses for both. I executed both defenses on alternating beats for the first 3 minutes of the fight. In the 4th minute, I began to attack. I attacked Hyun-woo first. I used the wind blade form's heavy compression, the variation Bak-hyun had developed himself, the variation that was the cutting wind's namesake, to put a single compressed blade through the air at the precise angle that would split the serpent strike's arc at its origin point. The blade hit. The serpent strike unraveled. Hyun-woo, for 1 beat, was without a follow-up. In that beat, I closed on him. I struck him with the wooden hilt of the broken sword, a downward strike across the collarbone, calibrated heavier than I had used on anyone in the fight to date. His collarbone broke. He staggered. He raised his offhand to defend. Tae-hyun, on the alternate beat, attacked my exposed back with the White Tiger's spirit claw, the form's most dangerous strike, a 5-line projection at the spine. I had known he would. I dropped to the floor. The 5-line projection passed over my back, hit Hyun-woo's already defending offhand, and tore the hand entirely off the arm. Hyun-woo screamed. It was the only time, in any chapter of the Manhwa, that he had ever screamed. The cooperation protocol broke. Tae-hyun, seeing what he had done to his ally, did the small hesitation of a man who had just understood that the protocol he had agreed to had been engineered against him. I came up from the floor in the same quarter-second. I struck Tae-hyun with the broken sword's hilt across the temple. Not lethal. Calibrated. Hard enough to stun. He folded. He hit the floor. I caught Hyun-woo with my left hand by the throat and lowered him, slowly, to his knees. I held his wrist closed against the stump of his right hand with a fast field tourniquet of compressed chi, a healer's technique I had picked up from one of the Choi House's attached cultivators in the 2nd week of preparation, and I sealed the bleeding. I said, in the quiet voice of the courtyard, "He lives if I want him to." Hyun-woo, on his knees, with his face the color of the stone, said, "Yes." I said, "I want him to." I released the seal. I stood up. I stepped back. Hyun-woo collapsed sideways on the stones, conscious, alive, missing a hand. Tae-hyun, on the stones beside him, was breathing. The courtyard was silent. The remaining members of the joint operation, the lieutenants who had been waiting outside the courtyard, the soldiers who had not yet engaged, the 4 small gang representatives who had been observing from the walls, did not move. I said, in the same quiet voice, "It is over." I said, "Anyone in this courtyard or on the walls who wishes to leave may leave. Anyone who wishes to stay and continue to serve the Black Serpent or the White Tigers may do so, on the understanding that the Black Serpent and the White Tigers are, from this moment, governed by terms I will set, and that the terms I will set will not include the protection economy, as it has been practiced." I said, "You have 90 seconds to decide." They left. Most of them, at any rate. A small number, I would later learn, by Taeho's count, approximately 40, remained in the courtyard, sitting down on the stones, with their weapons set aside. They were, by their faces, the ones whose cultivation careers had begun, like mine, in poverty. I would, in the next month, integrate every one of them into the cutting wind as lieutenants. But that was later. For now, on the stones of the courtyard, with Hyunwoo missing a hand and Taehyun unconscious beside him, I stood very still. The light came through the high walls at an afternoon angle. I thought, very quietly, it is done. The aftermath took 6 months. Hyunwoo was, by his own quiet insistence, retired. He gave up the Black Serpent in a formal ceremony 3 weeks after the courtyard. His remaining lieutenants, the ones I did not absorb, were dispersed into honest work under terms I oversaw. The Black Serpent ceased, in the records of the Hunters Association, to exist. Taehyun was, by his own choice, neither retired nor reduced. He remained the head of the White Tiger Brotherhood. He did, however, restructure the operation to fit the new cultivation regulatory framework. The framework Seo Yerim's committee had finalized in the 2nd month of the aftermath, and he and I, in the 3rd month, signed a public concordat that divided Seoul's cultivation operations between the Cutting Wind and the reformed White Tigers along lines neither of us, before that day, had imagined we would draw together. The concordat did not include a clause for me marrying anyone. The concordat did include a clause that established, for the first time in Korean cultivation history, a joint cultivation authority, a regulatory body with police powers, jointly funded by the noble houses and the operators, with Seo Yerim as its first chair, Yoon Da-eun as its first inspector general, and Park Min-ji's father, Lord Park, as its first treasurer. The Joint Cultivation Authority took, by the 6th month, the regulatory work the protection economy had previously been the worst form of, and replaced it with an actual regulatory framework that was, by every measurable signal, less corrupt than what had preceded it. Kim Ji-hye's film released in the 4th month. It was the biggest box office success of the year. She thanked, in her acceptance speech at the year-end awards, the Cutting Wind for permitting the work. She also, in the 5th month, finally got me to a 2nd dinner. The 2nd dinner went well. By the 6th month, the household I had not, exactly, set out to assemble had assembled itself. Min-ji stayed 3 nights a week at the office building's residential floor, which I had, on her quiet suggestion in the 2nd month, refurbished with 5 separate suites. Soo-yeon stayed 2 nights a week. Da-eun, who had stopped pretending her press credential was journalistic months earlier, stayed 4 nights. Yerim, who could not, by the temple's rules, stay over until she had completed the formal disengagement process from her Sanis position, was on track to complete the process by the start of the 8th month and had, in the meantime, established a small writing studio at the office that the temple's records officially logged as a regulatory consultation space. Ji-hye, whose schedule was the least predictable of the 5, stayed when she could, which was usually weekends. We did not, any of us, marry. We did not, any of us, intend to. The household had, by mutual agreement, a different structure. None of us had been written, in the Manhwa, into the lives any of us were now living. We had all, in different ways, refused the scripts we had been given. The household was the consequence of the refusal. Bak-hyun came down from the mountain in the 8th month. He arrived at the office without notice, in the same faded gray robes I had last seen him in, and he sat at my desk for an hour drinking tea and saying nothing. At the end of the hour he said, "You used the form." I said, "Yes, master." He said, "Do not call me master." I said, "Bak-hyun." He said, "You used the form well." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I have brought you the next set of scrolls." He set, on my desk, a leather satchel containing 7 more handwritten scrolls. They were, by their titles, the next 4 forms of the Wind Blade School as he had developed them in his disowned years. Forms his family's school had never seen, would never see, and would, by my own quiet promise to him at the start of the 9th month, never know about. He stayed at the office building for 3 weeks. He met the household. He approved of everyone except Ji-hai, who he said laughed too loudly, and Ji-hai, who had, in the past 9 months, learned to laugh louder, not less, adopted him immediately as a kind of grandfather figure who needed, she informed him, more laughing in his life. He stayed for 3 weeks. He went back to the mountain. I climbed the mountain twice a year for the rest of my life. The years that followed went the way the years following a successful refusal of a printed plot go. The Joint Cultivation Authority became, by the 2nd year, the model Korean cultivation regulation that other Asian cultivation nations began to study. Seo Yerim became, by the 3rd year, the youngest chair the Heavenly Temple had ever elected, and she ran the temple, by the 4th year, into a position of formal civic engagement it had not held in 3 centuries. Park Min-ji took her father's place as head of the Park Noble House in the 5th year, when her father, who had, despite my early disrespect, become a close friend over the regulatory years, formally retired. Choi Soo-yeon ran, for 2 terms, the authority's enforcement office, and her dry mouth became, over the years, slightly less dry, especially in the evenings at the household. Yoon Doon wrote, over 12 years, 3 books about the cultivation reforms of the period, all of which became standard texts. Kim Ji-hai made 11 more films, won every major Korean acting award twice, and produced, in her late 30s, 2 documentaries about the cultivation underworld that were, by their reach, more responsible for changing public opinion on the protection economy than any of the regulatory work that preceded them. The Cutting Wind, by the 6th year, had transitioned from an operating organization to a non-operating one. Its territories had been absorbed, by mutual agreement, into the authority. Its lieutenants, Taeho first, then the others, had taken roles in the authority's enforcement division. The building in eastern Gangnam where the courtyard fight had happened had, by the 7th year, been converted into a cultivation school for children of mortal families who had awakened to cultivation talent without the noble house resources to develop it. The school's first scholarship class had 80 children. The first graduating class, for years later, produced 14 foundation realm cultivators by age 20. I ran the school. I taught the wind blade form, with Bak Hyun's permission, to any child of the school who reached stage 5. I lived, with the household, in the building above the school. I never, in the rest of that life, saw Lee Tae-hyun fight again. He retired, after the Concordat, into the running of the White Tiger's new legal form, and he came to dinner at the household twice a year on the anniversary of the courtyard. He always brought, by tradition, 2 boxes of red bean buns from Halmoni Kang's noodle shop, which had become, over the years, the most photographed noodle shop in Seoul, in which Halmoni Kang continued to operate, alone, with her sculptor's hands, until she retired peacefully at the age of 97. I never, in the rest of that life, saw Kim Hyun-woo. He left Korea in the 3rd year. He resurfaced, by reports Taeho occasionally passed me, in various countries, in a small village in southern France in the 5th year, in a fishing town in northern Japan in the 8th, in a remote part of the Andes in the 11th. He never, by any account I received, contacted any of his former associates. He lived, by all reports, quietly. He kept the prosthetic hand the Choi family's healers had built for him in the 2nd year. He was, by every measurable signal, content. I never visited him. I thought, sometimes, about visiting him. I never did.